Welcome to Cap Nat Storyteller, your place for spine-chilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoy these eerie stories, please like and subscribe to hear more spine-tingling experiences. Comment below with where you're tuning in from and the time. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. Let's begin, if you dare. It was supposed to be just another late shift. The kind of night where the hours stretched endlessly, and the dull hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that filled the empty halls of the old hotel. The building had an eerie charm to it, like something out of a forgotten era, its marble floors worn down by years of footsteps, and the grand chandelier above casting long, soft shadows on the walls. Henry, Lucas, and Elijah had worked at the Grandview Hotel for months now, and by all accounts, they were used to the strange creaks and groans of the building. After all, it was an old hotel. The kind of place you'd expect strange sounds, flickering lights, and the occasional door that wouldn't stay shut. But tonight felt different. Guys, are we sure this is even a good idea? Elijah's voice was tight with nerves as he pulled a rag through the motions, wiping down the already spotless bar. He had always been the cautious one, the one who never joked about the strange rumors that surrounded the hotel. He was already nervous just being there past midnight. Henry, always the one to brush off anything that could be remotely scary, laughed. "Relax, man. You're starting to sound like an old woman." He flashed a grin at Lucas, who was setting up plates in the dining area. "It's just a hotel, a job. No ghosts, no creepy guests. Just us and the kitchen." Lucas shot them both a look from across the room, his brow furrowed as he adjusted the cutlery on a pristine white tablecloth. The kitchen was eerily quiet, too quiet. Normally, the sounds of the chef cooking and the bustle of the waitstaff would fill the space, but tonight, nothing. "Yeah, Henry," Lucas replied, his voice lower than usual. "But, didn't you hear about the old woman who stayed here last week? They say she checked in and never left." Elijah froze, his rag still in his hand, his mind racing back to the chilling rumors. The woman's room, number 304, had been left locked after she checked out, but no one had seen her leave. The staff had tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. No one could explain why. When they finally got it open the next day, they found it completely empty, except for a single, unlit candle burning in the middle of the room. The hairs on Elijah's neck stood up as he remembered the stories about the room, stories about strange lights, noises, and the overwhelming sense of being watched that had plagued those who entered. "Shut up," Henry scoffed, though even he couldn't hide the slight unease in his voice. "That's just gossip, man. This hotel is old, people make up stories." But as he spoke, a strange feeling crept up on him. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He glanced toward the dining area, where the flickering candlelight from the main hall seemed to sway, casting ghostly shadows that shouldn't have been there. "Look," Lucas muttered, his face pale, "I'm telling you, there's something off about this place. I've been hearing things, voices." He glanced nervously toward the staff kitchen door that led to the unused back rooms of the hotel. "I heard them last night. I thought it was just the wind, but..." He trailed off, eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Elijah swallowed hard. "What do you mean, voices? What kind of voices?" Lucas hesitated. "I don't know, it was like whispers. Just low, faint, but they were there. In the kitchen. In the halls. I don't know, man." Henry laughed again, but there was a slight edge to his tone. "You guys are freaking yourselves out. This is just an old hotel with old rumors. Nothing more." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was watching them. That something unseen was lingering just beyond their line of sight. The bell above the front door jingled softly, and they all turned in unison, expecting to see a guest entering. But there was no one. The door had swung open by itself. A cold chill ran down Henry's spine, but he didn't admit it. Great. Now we have a haunted door, he muttered, walking over to shut it. But as he reached for the handle, a sound echoed from deep within the hotel, like a low groan, distant but unmistakable. Did you hear that? Elijah whispered, his face pale. That came from the back rooms. Before Henry could respond, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. All right, this is not funny, Lucas said, his voice shaky. I didn't sign up for this. But Henry was already moving, reaching for his phone to turn on the flashlight. The dim beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but empty tables and chairs. The place felt hollow, suffocating, as if it had once been full of life, but now it was empty in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Then, a soft sound, a whisper, reached their ears. Help me. It was faint, like a breeze. But it was there. A voice, and it was coming from somewhere deep within the hotel. Without a word, the three boys froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a joke. Something, someone, was calling them. And just like that, the hotel had them in its grip. The silence that followed the whisper felt suffocating, as if the very air around them had thickened. The light from Henry's phone barely cut through the dark, and the shadows that crept along the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive. It was as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Lucas and Elijah exchanged glances, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Henry, still holding the phone's flashlight, took a slow step forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. Did you hear that? Elijah's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Yeah, Henry replied, his own voice low and uncertain. I heard it. The whisper had been faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It hadn't been the wind. It hadn't been an echo. It was clear, a voice. A voice that sounded desperate, pleading. Help me. Henry wasn't sure if it was his imagination or something more, but something about that voice chilled him to his core. He looked around the darkened hotel lobby, but there was no sign of anyone. No guests. No staff. Just emptiness. The flickering light from his phone illuminated the marble floors, the furniture shrouded in shadows. The dining area, where they had set up earlier, seemed even more silent than before, as if the hotel had swallowed the life from the room. The air was heavy, thick with something that wasn't quite right. And still, the voice echoed in his mind. Help me. Henry swallowed hard and turned to Lucas and Elijah. We need to check the back rooms. Now. Elijah's eyes widened. Are you insane? The back rooms? The ones no one goes into? Yeah, Henry said, his voice steadier than he felt. If there's someone back there, we need to make sure they're okay. But deep down, he wasn't sure if he was trying to help someone, or if he was hoping to put this all behind them. The hotel had always been a little strange, sure, but now it felt like something far more sinister was lurking just beyond their sight. The three of them walked cautiously toward the back hallway, the one that led to the older sections of the hotel, areas that had been closed off for years. The lights here were dim, and the paint on the walls had peeled away in places, revealing the bare, decaying wood beneath. The floor creaked under their footsteps, the sound magnified in the stillness. Henry tried to shake off the sense of dread that was slowly creeping over him. Look, it's probably just some prank, right? Someone messing with us. But even as he said it, a shiver ran down his spine. He had never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but tonight was different. Tonight felt wrong. As they walked further down the hallway, they reached a door at the end, a door they had never really noticed before. It was old, weathered, with brass handles that had tarnished over time. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and yet, somehow, it stood ajar. A sliver of darkened space peeked through the crack, as if something was waiting on the other side. "I don't know about this, man," Lucas said, his voice barely audible. "I don't like this. We should just call someone. Call the cops." "No," Henry said, his tone sharp. "We came this far. We'll check it out. We'll see what's going on." He pushed the door open slightly, the old wood groaning under his touch. The hallway beyond was even darker than the one they had just walked down. The air smelled musty, like something had been locked away for far too long. As the door creaked open further, Henry's flashlight illuminated the corridor in front of them. But there was something strange, something moving. A shadow, just out of sight, moving swiftly across the wall. It wasn't human. Henry's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" he whispered urgently, his grip tightening around the flashlight. "I didn't see anything," Elijah said, his voice tense. "You're imagining it, man." But Lucas, looking pale and shaken, stepped closer. "No, I saw something too. Something dark." Henry turned to look at him, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about? It's probably just a reflection or something." But Lucas shook his head. "I swear. It looked like it was moving toward us. The hallway felt like it was closing in on them, the darkness pressing closer, as if the hotel was trying to swallow them whole. The walls seemed to pulse with something alive, something ancient. The air grew thick, colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in a matter of seconds. "Let's just get out of here," Elijah muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, his fear now palpable. But Henry, despite his own growing unease, pushed forward, his footsteps slow but determined. The further they went, the stronger the sense of being watched became. It was as if the hotel itself had turned its eyes on them, its walls closing in with every step they took. And then, as they reached the end of the hallway, they saw it. The source of the whispers. At the far end of the corridor, a door was open, just slightly, and a faint light flickered from within. As they approached, the door creaked open wider, revealing a room they had never seen before. A room that shouldn't exist. It was a small, dimly lit space. The floor was covered in dust, the furniture covered in white sheets. But it wasn't the room that made their hearts race. It was the figure in the center. A woman, pale as death, sitting motionless in a chair. Her long, dark hair hung in front of her face, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She was dead. Or, at least, that's what they thought at first. But as Henry's flashlight swept across her, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Her head lifted slowly, her eyes, black as coal, glimmering in the light. She wasn't just dead. She was waiting. For them. The woman's eyes were black, empty, soulless. And yet, they stared at Henry, Lucas, and Elijah with an intensity that sent a freezing chill running through their veins. Her head had lifted so slowly, so unnaturally, that it seemed as though time itself had momentarily paused. The room grew colder still, and the light from Henry's phone flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. She can't be. Elijah's voice trailed off, his words caught in the web of terror that had suddenly tangled around all of them. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it deafening in his ears. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen to the spot, as though some invisible force was holding him there. His flashlight barely illuminated the woman's face, but what little light there was revealed something that made his stomach churn. Her skin was deathly pale, a sickly grayish hue, as if she had been untouched by life for far too long. Her lips were cracked, dry, and stained with something that looked disturbingly like blood. But it wasn't her appearance that made Henry's breath catch in his throat, it was the look in her eyes. The eyes that burned with an ancient hunger, an unspoken demand, as though she had been waiting for them for far longer than they could comprehend. "She's not real," Lucas muttered, his voice quivering, but his words lacked conviction. This isn't happening. But no matter how much they tried to convince themselves, the reality of it was undeniable. The woman was there. And she wasn't moving. Not yet. Henry, we need to leave. Now, Elijah said, his voice rising in panic. He grabbed Henry's sleeve, trying to pull him away from the room. But Henry couldn't tear his gaze away from the woman. Leave. Henry repeated, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would shatter the fragile silence. You don't understand. She's waiting for us, she's been waiting for us. The cold air around them seemed to thicken, closing in, wrapping around their limbs like a vice. Henry's flashlight flickered again, casting brief, unsettling shadows that twisted and contorted along the walls. The shadows moved, just out of sync with reality, shifting like something alive, as if they, too, were part of this twisted nightmare. She's not real, Lucas muttered again, his eyes wide with fear, but it was clear he was starting to lose his grip on his own words. His gaze was locked onto the woman now, too. The grip of terror had sunk its claws into them all. The woman's mouth opened, a faint rasping sound escaping from her lips. It wasn't a voice, not like the whisper they had heard earlier. It was something deeper, something guttural and wrong, like the sound of bones grinding against one another. It felt like the sound itself was scraping against their very souls. The moment she spoke, it was as if the world itself held its breath. The voice was soft, faint, but it carried with it an undeniable weight. A presence. Help me. It was the same voice they had heard earlier, the same desperate plea. But this time, it didn't sound like a call for aid. It sounded like a demand. A plea that was no longer from a living person but something darker, older, and far more dangerous. Lucas took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the room. This is a joke, right? Some kind of prank. But his words faltered when the woman slowly began to rise from the chair. Her movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by some unseen force. The sound of her joints cracking echoed in the stillness, a bone-chilling reminder that she was not human, not anymore. She was something worse. Henry could feel the weight of her gaze on him, even though she had yet to take a single step toward them. It felt like something was inside his chest, gripping his heart in an unrelenting vice, suffocating him. You have to go, Elijah whispered urgently, his voice barely audible over the growing sense of dread that seemed to choke the room. We have to get out of here. Now. But as he turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sudden sound of it reverberated through their bones, and they froze. Don't even think about running, the woman rasped, her voice now sharper, more menacing. It wasn't coming from her mouth. It was like the words themselves crawled from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around them. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes, those black, hollow eyes, were fixed on them, burning with an intensity that made it clear she could hear their every thought. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken again, pressing in closer, as though they were alive, watching, waiting for something. The temperature in the room had dropped so low now that Henry's breath came out in visible puffs, as if they were standing in the middle of a winter storm. His hands trembled, unable to keep the flashlight steady. We didn't mean to, Lucas started, his voice breaking, but the woman's cold, merciless gaze silenced him. Leave, she whispered again, the sound so quiet that it almost felt like it wasn't a sound at all, but a sensation that crawled beneath their skin. The shadows twisted in response, reaching out like dark tendrils, wrapping around their legs, their arms. Henry looked around in desperation, his mind scrambling for a way out. But no matter how hard he tried, the walls seemed to close in on him. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as though the very air was thickening with dread. The whispers were growing louder now, voices coming from everywhere, from every corner of the room, from inside his own head. You have to help me, the voice was insistent now, a shrill whisper that scraped against his sanity. It wasn't coming from the woman anymore, but from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was coming from everywhere. Henry could barely think. The panic was too much. He needed to get out. He had to get out. He could feel the air pressing against his lungs, suffocating him. Then, the woman's lips curled into a smile that stretched too wide, too unnatural to be human. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to glint in the dim light like knives ready to tear into flesh. "We're not leaving," she said, her voice now a low growl that vibrated through the room. "You're mine now." And in that instant, Henry knew. They were trapped. Not in the hotel, but in her. The darkness had become a living thing. It pressed in from all sides, suffocating them, crawling under their skin, making the hairs on the back of Henry's neck stand on end. The temperature had dropped so drastically that it was impossible to ignore. Their breath billowed out in the frigid air, each exhale a visible cloud that hung in the stillness before evaporating into the nothingness. But it wasn't just the cold, it was the presence that filled the room. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic drumbeat of fear. His fingers, numb and trembling, still gripped the flashlight, but the beam of light quivered in his grasp, doing little to cut through the dense blackness that seemed to swallow everything in sight. The shadows clung to the walls, twisted and contorted like figures in a nightmare, stretching out unnaturally, reaching toward them. "Henry," Elijah's voice cracked, barely a whisper, but it sliced through the tension like a blade. What is happening?" Henry could barely breathe, let alone answer. His mouth felt dry, his legs like lead, refusing to move. His thoughts were clouded by the terrible sight of the woman, her eyes, those endless, soulless pits of darkness that had stared into him. He could still feel the weight of her gaze, pressing against his skull, crawling into his mind. But she wasn't there anymore. At least, he didn't think she was. The room, once still, was now alive with movement, or at least, it felt alive. The shadows shifted, as if they were breathing, and Henry's mind screamed at him to look away, to move, to get out, but his body refused to obey. Lucas, standing close to him, suddenly jerked his head toward the corner of the room. His eyes were wide with fear, locked on something Henry couldn't see. "Do you hear that?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. Henry strained his ears, but all he could hear was the low, oppressive silence, except for the faintest rustling. It was coming from the corner, like the sound of something dragging, scraping against the floor. "Please," Elijah breathed out, his voice filled with dread. "I can't take this anymore. We need to leave. We need to leave now." Henry turned his head toward him, the panic now setting in his own chest like ice. But before he could respond, the rustling sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just something dragging against the floor. It was footsteps. Footsteps in the dark. One step. Then another. Slow. Purposeful. Too deliberate to be an accident. Too alive to be an echo. Lucas's body tensed beside Henry, and they both watched, horrified, as the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to gather, as if something, or someone, was forming within them. The darkness parted, and for the briefest moment, Henry could make out a shape. A tall figure, standing still, watching them. "Who's there?" Henry managed to croak, his voice hoarse, strained from fear. The figure didn't respond. The air thickened even more, the silence deafening, as the shape in the corner took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was tall, too tall, its movements jerky, stiff, as if it were trying to move in a way that didn't come naturally. And yet, despite its unnaturalness, it was undeniably human in shape. Henry could feel his heart thundering in his chest, threatening to break free. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper. His hand still held the flashlight, but his grip was weakening by the second. The figure moved closer, its body emerging from the shadows like a creature too monstrous to exist. As it stepped into the dim light, the full horror of it became apparent. Its skin was pale, sickly, like wax. The arms hung limp at its sides, the hands long and bony, the fingers unnaturally thin, like they were stretched too far. Its face, it was wrong. It wasn't a face at all. It was a mask. A human mask, but without features. No eyes. No mouth. Only smooth, flawless skin, stretched tight over what could have once been a face, but now was hollow, a disturbing void where the face should have been. It was like looking into the void of a person who had never been alive in the first place. The footsteps echoed in the silence as it moved closer, its head turning slightly as if studying them. Then it stopped, just a few feet away, and waited. Henry's stomach churned violently. He had to do something. He had to act. But his legs remained rooted to the floor, his mind too clouded by the terror gnawing at him. The air was suffocating, thick with dread. He could hear his heart, the pounding pulse in his ears, almost drowning out the rest of the world. And then the whispers returned. Low at first, faint, just barely above the threshold of hearing. But it grew louder. "Help me." The voice was coming from everywhere now. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air around them. It wasn't one voice. It was many. Echoing. Repeating. Clamoring for attention. Begging. "Help me." The figure in front of them took a step forward. Then another. And then it spoke. Its voice was soft, too soft, as if it had no real substance. But it still carried with it the weight of something old, something ancient. The voice scratched at Henry's brain, digging deep under his skin. "I am waiting for you." Before Henry could respond, the lights flickered, stuttering, as if the very electricity itself were being drained away. The shadows stretched across the walls, twisted and alive. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if they were not made of solid material but something far more sinister. Henry, his breath shallow, finally tore his eyes away from the thing in front of him, turning to his friends. Elijah looked pale, his face drained of all color, his lips trembling. Lucas's hands were shaking as he reached for the door, trying to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door. It had locked again. "You can't leave." The voice came again, this time more urgent, more desperate. "You're not leaving." Henry tried the handle himself, his hands trembling so badly that he could barely grip it. But the door wouldn't move. The pressure around them grew stronger, the shadows closing in, the whispers rising in a crescendo. "We're trapped," Elijah whispered in disbelief, his voice high with panic. The figure in the corner tilted its head, its empty face twisting into what could only be described as a grotesque smile. "No. You're not trapped." The thing's voice was calm now, too calm, like a predator before the kill. "You are mine." Henry's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the room, the very air thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. It was closing in. It was all closing in. They were not just trapped in the room. They were trapped in the hotel. And something far worse was waiting. The moment the thing spoke, the room seemed to exhale, its chilling presence wrapping tighter around Henry, Lucas, and Elijah. Every breath they took felt like it came from someone else, a force pushing air into their lungs against their will. The walls themselves seemed to hum with an eerie vibration, the very foundation of the hotel groaning under the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting. "You are mine." The words slithered through the air, each syllable carrying a weight of finality that made it impossible to ignore. The shadows were no longer passive. They were alive, writhing, reaching, growing longer with every passing second. Henry could feel their presence on the back of his neck, like cold fingers trailing over his skin. He turned his head, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark corners, but there was nothing, just darkness that seemed to breathe in time with his panic. But the feeling was there. A suffocating presence, waiting, watching. And the whispers, the voices, they had started again. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was an entire chorus, overlapping, speaking in twisted, half-formed sentences. Some were pleading, others were angry. Some seemed familiar, while others were foreign and alien in ways that made Henry's stomach churn. They all spoke in unison, but the words felt like they were crawling inside his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like thick, cloying vines. "You shouldn't have come," one voice whispered, its tone thick with malice. "Elijah, Henry, Lucas," another voice breathed their names in a low, guttural rasp. "Help me." But there was no help. Not for them. Not in this place. The thing in the corner moved again, its shadow stretching like a dark, monstrous claw, its hollow face now becoming sharper in the dim light. It didn't need to move closer, the shadows did it for it, wrapping around them, pressing in from all sides, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Lucas tried the door once more, his hands frantic as he tugged at the handle, but it was futile. The door wouldn't open. It couldn't. Whatever force had locked it now had a grip on everything, the room itself sealed shut in ways that went beyond the physical. Henry's eyes shot to Elijah, who was backing away toward the far wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale as though the color had been drained from him. He reached for his phone, but the screen was cracked, a jagged line cutting across the display like a gash in reality itself. "What the hell is happening?" Lucas finally choked out, his voice trembling. The shadows shifted. And then they moved. One of them, a tendril of blackness, broke free from the corner and shot forward like a snake, wrapping around Lucas's ankle in an instant. He gasped, his eyes widening as he tried to pull away, but it was too late. The shadow tightened, pulling him off balance. "Get it off me!" Lucas screamed, thrashing desperately, his fingers scrabbling at the inky tendril that held him captive. Henry reached out, his hand trembling, but the shadow recoiled at his touch. It was like trying to grasp smoke, his fingers slid through it as though it wasn't there at all, yet it had a tangible weight that kept Lucas pinned to the floor. "Help me," the whisper echoed through Henry's mind, louder now, clearer. It was no longer coming from the walls, but from the shadows themselves. The voices were alive. And they were feeding on the terror in the room. Henry was paralyzed, his body frozen by the sheer weight of the situation. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, to save Lucas. But he couldn't move. Elijah wasn't faring any better. His eyes were wide, his pupils pinpricks of panic, his body trembling. He backed up further into the corner, away from the shadow, but in doing so, he only seemed to draw more of the darkness toward him. It was like the very air around them was solidifying, each breath they took weighed down with the oppressive force. And then, without warning, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, more insistent. "Help me. Leave, now. It's too late." The room was no longer just filled with shadows. They had changed. They were no longer silent observers. They were hungry. The thing in the corner finally moved. Its featureless face seemed to open, stretching, its mouth widening impossibly. But there were no teeth, only a black hole, an abyss that threatened to swallow everything around it. And as it opened, the shadows twisted together, merging into a single mass that began to flow toward them, undulating like a mass of smoke and darkness. Henry felt the air grow heavier, each breath a battle. The shadows crawled closer, reaching for him, for Lucas, for Elijah. The room was shrinking, and the oppressive weight of the dark was pressing in from all sides. And then, just as the darkness seemed to engulf them, there was a sound. A low creaking, a grinding noise, like the earth itself was splitting. It came from above. The ceiling cracked open. A thin, jagged line split down the center, like a wound opening on the surface of the world itself. And then, from the split, something poured down, a black, viscous liquid that dripped, thick and slow, staining the floor in front of them. At first, it looked like oil. But then it moved, alive. It slithered toward them, leaving a trail of black behind it. "What the hell is that?" Lucas gasped, his voice a mix of disbelief and terror. But there was no answer. Henry's thoughts raced. He had no explanation, no understanding of what was happening, what was coming for them. But he felt it. The sensation of something watching them. Something waiting. "Leave," the voice whispered again, louder this time, the sound coming from all directions, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. Elijah's eyes were wild now. He grabbed Henry's arm with a desperate grip. "We need to get out of here. Now." But the door was still sealed. The walls had closed in tighter. The black liquid spread across the floor, now creeping toward them in slow, deliberate movements. The whispers grew more frantic, the air thick with terror. The shadows pressed in, their shapes twisting like monstrous hands. "Help me," the voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream. A desperate, desperate scream that sent a shiver down Henry's spine. He could hear Lucas' panicked breathing beside him. The ground beneath them felt unstable, shifting, as if the room itself was beginning to warp, to twist. The walls seemed to lean inward, as though the hotel itself were alive, hungry, and it was closing in on them. But there was no escape. They were trapped. Trapped in the suffocating grip of whatever had been waiting for them all along. And then, as the black liquid finally reached their feet, the lights flickered once more, before plunging them into total, suffocating darkness. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was alive, suffocating them, pressing down on their very souls. Each breath they took was a struggle, as though the air itself was being choked out of the room. The shadows had become something more, something far worse. Henry's hands trembled as he tried to grasp for something, anything, to steady himself. The walls were shifting, warping in ways that defied reason, stretching and twisting like the limbs of some monstrous entity. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, unstable, as though it was alive and moving with them. He could still feel the weight of the whispers in his mind, pressing against his skull, clawing at his thoughts. The sound of the black liquid, thick and viscous, slithering across the floor grew louder, more insistent. It was pooling around their feet, wrapping itself around their ankles like an invasive force, slowly pulling them down. Henry could feel the cold, sticky substance creeping up his legs, sucking him deeper into the nightmare. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a thunderous roar of fear. "What is this?" Elijah's voice cracked, breaking the oppressive silence as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with panic. "What is happening to us?" Henry couldn't answer. There were no answers. There was no explanation for what was happening. It was beyond their understanding, beyond anything they could comprehend. They were trapped in something far worse than a haunted hotel. They were trapped in a living, breathing nightmare, a place that was feeding off their fear, suffocating them with every passing second. Lucas, still struggling to free himself from the grasp of the shadow tendril, looked up with terror in his eyes. The room had changed. The walls had become jagged, like the interior of a broken cave, the ceiling lowering with each passing moment. It felt as though the space around them was compressing, pulling them towards some unseen, unimaginable center. A dark, choking void that beckoned them closer with every shift of the shadows. "Please," Elijah whispered, his voice small, barely audible against the backdrop of the whispers that had now become a cacophony. "Help us." But the voices, those thousand voices, weren't just in their heads anymore. They were here, in the room with them. They were everywhere. Henry could hear them now, coming from every direction. They didn't sound human. They didn't even sound alive. It was a horrific, guttural sound, a mixture of pleading, crying, and laughter, all distorted and twisted, like the voices of the damned. Some were low, almost inaudible, while others screamed directly into his mind, their words clawing at his sanity. "You will join us. It's too late. We are waiting for you." Henry's pulse raced, his hands shaking violently as he turned toward the door. He tried it again, with all his strength, but the handle wouldn't budge. There was no escape. The hotel had locked them in, sealed them off from the outside world, trapping them in its suffocating grip. And then, from the corner of the room, the figure appeared again. It was moving now, no longer standing still in the shadows. Its face, that mask of smooth, featureless skin, gleamed faintly in the darkness, the pale surface seeming to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Its body was no longer stiff, no longer rigid. It moved like something that had once been human but now had forgotten how to walk, dragging itself closer toward them with jerky, unnatural movements. Henry's stomach churned. The air tasted like iron, thick with the stench of fear and decay. The shadows around them twisted and stretched, growing longer, more contorted with every passing second, as though the very room itself was bending to the will of the thing that stood before them. The thing tilted its head, its smooth, featureless face coming closer. Henry could feel its presence, the pressure building, as if it were getting inside his head. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see it anymore. But his body refused to obey, his eyes locked onto the figure as it drew nearer. "We are waiting for you," the thing whispered, its voice a rasping, hollow sound that made Henry's skin crawl. The shadows, once just passive observers, began to press in closer, drawing the figure forward. Lucas was still struggling, trying to pry himself free from the darkness that gripped his ankle, but it was pointless. The tendril had wrapped around him like a vice, and no matter how much he pulled, it only tightened. "Elijah, help him!" Henry cried, but his voice cracked under the weight of fear. His legs were shaking so violently that it was hard to keep his balance. Elijah nodded, his face pale with terror. He reached out to grab Lucas's hand, but the shadows moved faster. They were alive. They knew. With a sudden, sickening jerk, Lucas was pulled off the ground, his body lifted into the air as the shadows wrapped themselves tighter around him. He screamed, loud, guttural, a sound that shook Henry to his core, but it was too late. The shadows had him. Henry reached out, but it was like reaching for the edge of an abyss. The shadows pulled Lucas in, swallowing him whole. His scream was cut off in an instant, and the room fell into a terrible silence. "No!" Elijah shouted, his voice raw with desperation. He collapsed to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was happening again. One by one, they were being taken. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The shadows began to shift once more, crawling along the walls like living things, writhing in the air. The whispers grew louder, their urgency palpable. "Join us," they murmured, echoing around the room, growing louder with every passing second. The thing in the corner stretched toward them, its mouth opening wider, revealing that black, yawning void. Henry could feel it now, tugging at his thoughts, wrapping its dark fingers around his mind, pulling him toward the edge of sanity. His pulse raced. His thoughts began to blur together, one fading into the next, the world spinning around him. The walls were closing in. He could feel them breathing. The air was thick, heavy, like it had weight, like it was pushing down on him, threatening to crush him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His body felt heavy, too heavy. The darkness was swallowing him whole, consuming him, dragging him down into the abyss that had been waiting for him all along. But then, just as the thing in the corner was about to engulf him completely, a sharp sound cut through the silence. A crack. And then another. The walls began to splinter, the hotel groaning in agony, as though it, too, was suffering. And then, in an instant, the room shook. The floor beneath their feet cracked open, a jagged seam splitting down the center. Henry could feel the ground tremble, hear the sound of something moving underneath, something alive, something hungry. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the walls shuddering like a living thing in its death throes. The entire hotel seemed to groan, as though it were alive, an ancient beast waking from a long, tormented slumber. Henry's pulse hammered in his chest as the floor split wider, sending a sharp, splintering crack through the room. The darkness surged forward, its tendrils racing toward them, faster than ever before. Elijah screamed. His voice was high-pitched, frantic, as he tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. The shadows were everywhere, closing in from all sides. The black liquid pooled around their feet, its thick, oily texture seeping upward, inch by inch, threatening to drown them. It's too late. The whispers were all around them now. Louder. More urgent. Desperate. The thing in the corner, the entity that had been waiting, moved again, its grotesque face now open wide, revealing that bottomless abyss within. The shadows stretched out like claws, reaching for Elijah first, but Henry pushed him away, his heart racing. No. Get away from him. Henry yelled, his voice hoarse with terror. But there was no stopping it. The thing's grasp was unyielding. The black tendrils wrapped around Elijah's legs with unnatural speed, pulling him toward the center of the room. His cries echoed off the walls, but they were lost in the cacophony of whispers and the unsettling sounds of the hotel, creaking, groaning, shifting, like a beast on the brink of madness. Henry was frozen, rooted to the spot. His body refused to move, his limbs numb from the overwhelming dread that had taken hold of him. But then, a wave of heat washed over him, intense, suffocating, pulling him back into the nightmare. He tried to breathe, but it was like the air had thickened, turning to tar. His head felt heavy, like it was going to burst. Lucas. Elijah. They were gone. It was just him now. The last one standing. And then, something shifted in the corner of the room. A whisper, too quiet to be heard by the human ear, but felt in the depths of Henry's soul. A warning. A command. Come closer. The shadows began to move with purpose. They knew. Something cold brushed against Henry's cheek, a slow, deliberate caress that made his skin crawl. He whipped his head around, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. A darkness that seemed to have weight, as if it was solid, a tangible presence in the room. And then he saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows. Not the creature that had been lurking in the corner, the one with the black, gaping maw, but something else. Something more human. Or at least, it looked human. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for one of them, one of the boys who had once walked these halls. But there was something wrong about it. Something twisted. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth was a jagged, distorted smile that stretched too wide. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound against the floor, as if it were gliding. The creature, or whatever it was, stopped in front of Henry. Its eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he thought he might lose his sanity entirely. The gaze was so intense, so suffocating, that Henry felt himself being drawn into the abyss. "You should have left," the thing whispered in a voice that sounded like his own, but hollow, distorted. It was as though the very walls were speaking through it. "But you stayed. You wanted to stay." Henry's throat tightened. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His mind was racing, spinning, trying to make sense of the impossible reality he was now living in. The creature took a step closer, its breath cold against Henry's face, but there was no escaping it. "You wanted to know," the creature continued, its voice now barely a whisper. "You wanted to see. To feel. You wanted to understand. But there are things you can never understand." It reached out a hand. Its fingers were elongated, gnarled, like claws. But they were soft, too soft, like the fingers of a corpse, decayed and cold. Henry didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to even breathe in its presence. But the creature was getting closer, its hand outstretched, closing the distance between them. "You are mine now," it said, its smile widening impossibly, until it seemed to stretch beyond its face. And then the ground trembled again. This time, it wasn't just the room. It was the entire hotel. The entire building. The hotel had become something else. It wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a thing. A beast. The walls cracked and groaned, shifting, bulging outward, as though they were no longer confined to the same physical limits. Henry could hear the air grow thin, as though every inch of the building was constricting. His chest tightened, the pressure building in his skull. The walls were closing in, closer, closer, until there was nowhere left to run. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but his limbs felt like they were made of stone, unresponsive, unyielding. The shadows closed in around him, swallowing him whole. He could feel them, climbing over his body, crawling up his arms, his legs, his chest. The darkness was alive, writhing, twisting into something that was no longer just darkness. It had form. It had shape. It had teeth. "Join us," the thing whispered once more, but this time, the words weren't just in his head. They were inside him, crawling through his veins, sinking deep into his bones, like the final breath of the hotel, claiming him. The air turned to ice. The shadows wrapped around his body like chains, pulling him closer to the black abyss at the center of the room. The hotel's pulse beat against his chest, faster, faster, until it was the only sound he could hear. His heart pounded in time with it. And then, everything went silent. For a moment, everything stopped. The whispers. The shadows. The hotel. Everything ceased. It was then that Henry understood. The hotel wasn't just alive, it was feeding on them. On their fear. It was a parasite, a living thing that needed them to survive. And now, it had them all. One by one, they had been consumed. But not just physically. Mentally. Emotionally. They were part of it now. The building was their tomb. He had been drawn in. And now, he would never leave. The camera pulls back slowly, the screen darkening, leaving only the whispers echoing in the void. And then, just before the video fades to black, a single, chilling voice whispers through the silence. "It's your turn now." It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just like any other at a sleepy college campus. But for Lucas, the night he decided to escape would become a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had heard the whispers, the strange stories about the abandoned wing of the old dormitory. They said the students who went there didn't come back the same. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He slipped out of his dorm, down the deserted hallways, past the locked doors, and into the darkened corridor that no one dared to enter. What he found there, what he saw, no one would believe him. By the time the sun came up, Lucas was gone. His friends still don't know where he is. And to this day, no one dares ask what happened to him that night. But there's a truth that still lingers on the campus, one that Lucas never had the chance to expose. It was past midnight when Lucas decided he couldn't stand it any longer. The whispers. The rumors. The strange looks every time someone mentioned the old dormitory wing. The one that had been locked for years. No one went near it. No one talked about it. But everyone seemed to know something about it. Something they weren't willing to share. Lucas had always been the curious type, maybe too curious. His friends James and Elijah had warned him, but the more they tried to discourage him, the more determined he became. It wasn't just the stories about the strange noises at night or the unsettling feeling that lingered around the place. It was the fact that no one, absolutely no one, dared venture near it. The fear was palpable. And that fear, that unnerving uncertainty, gnawed at him. The wind howled outside his dorm window as Lucas sat there in the darkness, staring at his phone screen. It was 1:45 a.m. Too late to be up, but too early to sleep. He glanced over at his roommates, James, who was snoring softly, and Elijah, who was curled up in a blanket, completely oblivious. Lucas wasn't like them. He didn't shy away from the unknown. He had to know the truth. He had to see for himself what lay behind those locked doors. He got up, moved silently to the door, and peeked out. The hallway was empty. It always was. The college was nearly deserted after dark. Most students were either asleep or out at parties. But Lucas didn't care about that. He didn't care about the rules or the looks he'd get. There was something calling him, something he couldn't ignore. With one last glance over his shoulder, he stepped out of his room. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long, eerie shadows along the cracked walls. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, the only sign that this building had once been full of life. Now, it was eerily quiet. The floors creaked under his feet as Lucas made his way down the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest with every step. He reached the end of the hallway, where the staircase to the old wing stood. The door was closed, but the lock was broken. That had been the first sign to Lucas that something was wrong. No one had bothered to repair it, and no one had bothered to explain why. The cold air seemed to seep through the cracks in the door, as if it were alive, waiting. Waiting for someone to come. And now, that someone was Lucas. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The old wing was darker than he'd expected, the only light coming from the dim emergency lights along the floor, casting ghostly glows in every corner. It felt as if time itself had stopped in this part of the building, as though the air had grown stagnant, the walls slowly closing in on him. He stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. The hallway stretched on, endless and silent, save for the distant sound of something scraping against the walls. Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. It sounded like nails, like claws. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as his imagination running wild. He wasn't scared, at least, that's what he told himself. He had to be brave. The rumors didn't scare him. The fear in the eyes of his classmates didn't scare him. He had to find out what was going on in this place. Lucas walked further into the wing, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. He passed by several rooms, their doors either hanging ajar or completely off their hinges. The paint on the walls was peeling, revealing the old brick beneath. Everything about the place screamed neglect. But it was more than that. It was the sense that something was wrong. He reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see into the room. His curiosity pulled him closer. As he pushed the door open, the hinges groaned, as if protesting against his intrusion. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. A single bed, a dresser, and a desk. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the photographs pinned to the wall. Lucas stepped closer to get a better look. The photos were old, faded, yellowed with age. But it was the faces in the photos that sent a chill through his bones. Students, some of them unfamiliar, but others, they looked like people he knew. Friends of his. And there, in the corner of the room, was a photo of himself. His heart skipped a beat. How could that be? It was a picture from last semester, one taken during orientation. He remembered it clearly. But the room, this room, hadn't existed back then. A sudden crash from behind him sent him stumbling forward, his heart racing. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the darkness that had begun to creep in, slowly swallowing the light from the hallway. Lucas's breath became shallow. He had to leave. He had to get out of this place. But as he turned to run, a voice, a whisper, stopped him dead in his tracks. "You're not supposed to be here." It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, more urgent, until it was a scream. Lucas spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Silent. Except for the cold, suffocating air that seemed to press in on him from all sides. And then the door slammed shut behind him. Panic surged through Lucas as he tried to yank the door open. But it wouldn't budge. The handle twisted, but the door was locked from the other side. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder. Not just one voice now, but many. They were everywhere. Echoing off the walls, bouncing around the room. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. He pressed his back against the wall, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it never did. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more defined. It felt like they were moving, shifting. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, something moved. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he saw the figure standing there, watching him. It was a person. But it wasn't. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, ragged clothes hanging from its body. Its face was pale, its eyes dark, sunken into hollow sockets. And its mouth was wide open, stretching impossibly wide as it let out a sound, a terrible, gurgling scream that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth itself. And then, the floor beneath Lucas's feet started to shake. The shadows closed in. The whispers grew louder. Lucas wasn't alone anymore. Lucas's heart raced as the air around him thickened, pressing in like a heavy fog. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any escape, but the walls seemed to close in, tightening with every passing second. The whispers continued, no, not just whispers now, but voices, low and guttural, merging into a symphony of torment that twisted in his ears. Each voice was distorted, like it was coming from deep within the earth, from a place far beyond where any living thing should exist. He pressed his back harder against the cold, cracked wall, willing himself to breathe, to think. But his thoughts were scattered, disjointed. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get away, to run from the thing in the corner of the room. The figure, the one with the hollow, empty eyes, had not moved. It stood there, unnaturally still, its long fingers draped at its sides like a grotesque statue. But the darkness that clung to it, like a shroud, seemed to pulse, a rhythm that Lucas could feel in his very bones. The air felt alive, suffocating, as though it was trying to reach out and grab him. A chill ran down his spine. He couldn't understand it. Why was this happening? What was this thing? His eyes snapped back to the figure in the corner. It hadn't moved, but something in its presence was changing. The longer Lucas stared at it, the more the shadows around it seemed to bend, to warp, as if the room itself was distorting, twisting into something unrecognizable. A soft scraping sound suddenly filled the air. It was coming from the floor. Lucas's gaze fell to the ground beneath him, and his blood ran cold. The shadows, they were moving, creeping slowly toward him, gathering like an army of dark hands. He could see them, feel them, pulsing, writhing, stretching out from the figure in the corner, advancing on him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were urging him, beckoning him forward. Don't let it find you. Lucas's breath hitched in his throat. The voice was a rasp, barely audible, but unmistakable. A warning. Suddenly, the shadows surged. With a sound like the cracking of bones, they erupted from the floor, crawling up his legs, their cold fingers latching onto him. Lucas gasped and tried to pull away, but they were strong, too strong. They clung to him, dragging him down, pulling him closer to the thing in the corner. No! No! Lucas screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the dark. His fingers scrabbled at the floor, his nails scraping against the old wood, but the more he fought, the tighter the shadows gripped him, the more they dragged him down. He felt the weight of them, the overwhelming force that seemed to pull at every fiber of his being. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could help him escape. But all he could think of was the thing in the corner. The thing with the hollow eyes. Its gaze never wavered from him. It seemed to be watching him with a sickening amusement, its expression blank, empty, as if it were waiting for something. Then it began to move. Slowly at first, like it was stretching after a long slumber. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, jerking and twisting, as if they weren't meant to move like that. The air grew colder still, and Lucas felt his skin crawl, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. With a sickening snap, the figure took a step forward. And then another. And another. Each step was heavy, deliberate, as if the thing was savoring the moment. Lucas couldn't move. He couldn't escape. The shadows that clung to his legs were now up to his waist, creeping higher, dragging him inch by inch closer to the figure. His pulse thundered in his ears. The whispers were louder now, filling his head with maddening sounds. There was no escape. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't scream. All he could do was watch, helpless, as the creature moved closer. And then, as if it had been waiting for this very moment, the thing opened its mouth. It was a grotesque, cavernous hole, its jaw unhinging far wider than any human mouth should ever go. The darkness inside its mouth seemed to suck in the very air around it, distorting the space, pulling everything into it. Lucas felt his entire body go numb. He couldn't move, couldn't even blink. All he could do was stare at that gaping hole, at the swirling darkness that seemed to reach out to him, promising nothing but despair. And then the thing spoke. Its voice was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force that echoed through his very soul. Welcome, to the forgotten. The words hung in the air, each syllable a chilling weight on his chest. And with those words, the shadows surged forward, engulfing him completely. Lucas woke with a start. He gasped, his body jerking upright as he shot his eyes around the room. Sweat dripped down his face, and his heart thundered in his chest. He was back in the small room, the one with the photographs. The photographs on the wall, his face among them. The room was eerily silent, but there was something wrong. The door, he had been locked in, trapped, but now it stood wide open. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stood up, his legs shaking beneath him. The silence in the room was unbearable. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. It felt so real. It had to have been real. But what did it mean? He stumbled toward the door, still reeling from the terror he had just experienced. He had to leave. He had to get out of that place. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee before whatever it was that had just claimed him could come back. As he reached the doorway, something caught his eye. The photograph on the wall, the one with his face, had changed. His own eyes, once staring blankly, now followed him. They weren't just photos anymore. They were watching him. Waiting. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped through the doorway, the cold, stagnant air of the old wing pressing against him like an unseen force. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He couldn't shake the image of the thing with the hollow eyes, its gaping mouth stretching impossibly wide. But there was something else, something that gnawed at him, clawing at the edges of his thoughts. The photos. The way they had changed, the way his own eyes seemed to follow him. He had to get out. That much was certain. But the hallway stretched before him, impossibly long and silent, like a tunnel leading nowhere. The door behind him had slammed shut as soon as he'd stepped into the corridor, sealing him in. His stomach churned, and his legs shook as he forced himself to move. The shadows that had crept around him in the room seemed to have followed, clinging to the walls, slithering across the floor, their cold presence lingering in the corners of his vision. Lucas felt the weight of every step as if the building itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He could feel it in his bones, the same suffocating pressure that had gripped him in the room with the creature. The whispers started again, low at first, then growing louder, until they were a chorus of voices in his head, each one more frantic than the last. Run. Don't look back. It's too late. He stumbled forward, his breath ragged as he tried to push the sounds from his mind. But the closer he got to the exit, the worse it became. The walls seemed to bend around him, the space warping, twisting, as if reality itself were losing its grip. A sudden, sharp sound made him freeze. A door creaked open behind him. Lucas's body went rigid, and his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, as if the world had slowed to a crawl, he turned around. The door at the end of the hallway, the one he had passed by just moments ago, was now ajar. He had seen it closed, had been certain of it. But now it was open, revealing only darkness beyond. The air felt colder. Much colder. And then, there was movement inside. A figure. Lucas's eyes widened as he stared at the shadowy outline. The figure moved closer, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't like the thing in the room. It was human, or at least, it looked like it should be. But something about it didn't feel right. The way it moved was jerky, unnatural, as though it were caught between two worlds, struggling to remain in this one. Lucas's instincts screamed at him to run, to flee before it could see him, but his feet wouldn't obey. He stood frozen, watching the figure move closer. It stepped into the hallway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. But as it emerged from the shadows, Lucas saw its face. It was a face he recognized. It was James. His friend, his roommate, the one who had been sleeping just an hour ago in the room across the hall. But this James, this wasn't the same person. His eyes were wide, vacant, devoid of any recognition. His face was pale, drawn, as if the life had been drained from it. His lips were cracked, bloodied, and his clothes hung off his frame like they were a size too big. Lucas took a hesitant step back. "James," he whispered, his voice trembling. James's head tilted slowly, the unnatural movement sending a wave of nausea through Lucas. His eyes locked onto Lucas's, but they weren't the eyes of his friend. They were hollow, empty, as though there was nothing behind them. And then, with a voice that didn't sound like James at all, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in the hallway, the air around them growing thick with tension. Lucas's skin prickled as he took another step back, his pulse quickening. He had to leave. He had to escape before it was too late. But the figure wasn't finished. It took another step forward, its limbs twitching, jerking in a way that no human movement should ever resemble. The shadows around it seemed to stretch out, as if the darkness was coming alive, feeding off the figure's unnatural presence. "You don't get to leave," James's voice rasped, the words distorted, warped, as if something inside him was trying to claw its way out. Lucas felt his throat tighten, fear pooling in his stomach. He could feel the coldness of the air pressing against him, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if the building itself was closing in. The shadows that had been trailing him seemed to surge forward, blocking any escape, pulling him into the dark. James's eyes twitched, then narrowed. The figure in front of him began to twitch violently, its body convulsing, as if it were fighting against something inside it. Then, without warning, it lunged. Lucas's instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind him. His heart raced in his chest as he sprinted down the hallway, the door to the stairwell just ahead. But the whispers, the cold air, the shadows, everything seemed to be closing in on him. With every step, the darkness seemed to pull at his heels, inching closer, swallowing the light around him. The door to the stairwell was just within reach, but it felt like an eternity away. He could hear James's voice, no, it wasn't James anymore, calling after him, growing distorted, twisted, as if the thing that had once been his friend was being overtaken. "Run, Lucas! Run!" it screamed, the voice now completely inhuman, a guttural shriek that tore through the silence of the hallway. Lucas's chest tightened as he reached for the door handle, his hand shaking violently. He pulled it open just as the shadows reached for him, cold fingers brushing against his skin. He didn't look back. The stairwell was empty. The light above flickered, casting eerie shadows across the stone steps. Lucas raced down, his feet pounding against the cold concrete. Every turn felt like it could be his last. He didn't know if the thing was still behind him, but he didn't want to find out. He reached the ground floor and burst through the door, almost colliding with the wooden frame. The hallway outside was dimly lit, but it felt like a world away from the oppressive darkness of the old wing. But as he ran toward the exit, the whispers returned. Soft at first, almost like a whisper in the wind. But then, it became clearer. Louder. "It's not over." He froze. The voice wasn't in his head this time. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere behind him. Lucas turned around slowly, his stomach turning. The hallway was empty. But then, he saw it. In the reflection of the glass door, standing behind him, was James, or what was left of him. The face was twisted in agony, its mouth open in a silent scream. The hollow eyes stared at Lucas, and for a moment, he swore he saw them blink. It was then that he understood. James was just the beginning. Lucas's pulse raced as he stared into the reflection of the glass door. The hollow eyes of the thing that had once been James locked onto his, unblinking, as if the very reflection of his fear was feeding the creature's hunger. He turned his head quickly, desperate to escape, but the hallway before him stretched endlessly, like an abyss that refused to end. The weight of the thing behind him pressed in, the silence around him suffocating, and yet, he could still hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic, more urgent. "It's not over, Lucas." The words echoed in his mind, each syllable a death knell, like the closing of a door he couldn't escape from. His feet refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. But he couldn't stay here. He couldn't let that thing catch him. With a sharp breath, he snapped his gaze away from the reflection, forcing his legs to carry him forward. The exit was just ahead, the promise of fresh air, of freedom. But even as he ran, he could feel the shadows creeping around him, slithering like snakes along the walls, pulling at him, tugging at his very soul. The darkness that had followed him from the old wing was never far behind. "Run, Lucas." This time, the voice wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from all around him, filling his ears with the sound of 100 desperate, pleading whispers. Each one tugged at him, trying to hold him back, to drag him into the dark depths of whatever nightmare had taken root in this place. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he grabbed the handle. The cold metal sent a shock through his fingers, but it didn't matter. He yanked it open, and the gust of fresh air hit him like a wave. For a moment, he thought he might be free, but the moment he stepped outside, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. The air felt wrong. It was thick, dense with something he couldn't name. And then he saw it. The campus. The once familiar grounds that he had known for years now seemed distorted, alien. The trees that lined the paths were twisted, their branches contorted in unnatural angles, reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the air. The sky above was dark, a swirling mass of storm clouds that blocked out the sun. The campus was silent, too silent. No students, no voices, no sound of life, just the eerie stillness of a place abandoned by time. But worse than the silence was the feeling that he was being watched. He turned, scanning the campus, his heart racing as he searched for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The wind howled through the trees, and the leaves rustled in the distance, but no one was there. Except for the shadows. They moved, creeping along the edges of the campus, slinking between the trees and buildings, as though they were alive, as though they had a will of their own. And they were getting closer. Lucas's throat tightened. He couldn't stay out here. He had to keep moving, had to get somewhere, anywhere, where he might be safe. But where could he go? The campus was a maze, a labyrinth of corridors and forgotten rooms, each one more dangerous than the last. And the longer he stayed out in the open, the more the shadows seemed to close in on him. He turned toward the nearest building, the library. It was old, a massive stone structure that had always been a place of refuge, a place to hide from the chaos of the outside world. But now, as he approached it, the door creaked open by itself, the dark interior beckoning him in like some kind of hungry beast. Lucas hesitated, his mind screaming at him to run, to get away from this place, but the shadows were closing in. He couldn't stay out here. He had no choice. With a shuddering breath, he stepped inside. The air in the library was thick, heavy with dust and the smell of old wood. The walls seemed to loom over him, the shelves stretching high above, filled with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. There was a silence here, too, but it wasn't the same silence as outside. This silence was deeper, darker, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. Lucas's footsteps echoed through the vast, empty space as he moved deeper into the library, his eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of danger. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt the weight of something watching him. The walls seemed to press in, and the shadows in the corners shifted, curling like tendrils, watching him. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the library into darkness for a brief moment. When they came back on, the air seemed to change. It was colder now. The whispers, too, were louder, no longer just in his mind, but real, tangible, filling the room from all directions. "You can't hide, Lucas." The voice came from behind him, low and distorted, echoing off the walls. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no one there. "You're already too late." It was then that he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the library, half hidden in the shadows. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and as it moved toward him, its features became clearer. It was James. But it wasn't James anymore. Not entirely. The skin on its face had been pulled taut, stretched over the bone, and its eyes, those eyes, were hollow. Empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a horrible, gurgling noise that made Lucas's stomach churn. The figure moved closer, its legs jerking, unnatural, like it was walking against its own will. Lucas could feel his body freeze, a primal fear taking hold of him, rooting him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. "James," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What happened to you?" The thing that had once been his friend didn't answer. Instead, it took another step forward, and then another, until it was standing just inches from him. Lucas could feel its cold breath against his face, could smell the rancid, decaying stench that clung to its skin. And then, for the first time, the creature spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." And with that, it lunged. Lucas's eyes shot open, and he bolted upright, gasping for air. His entire body was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He was back in his room. The room that had once felt safe. But now, everything felt wrong. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, and the whispers, they were real this time. They were coming from the walls. "You're not safe, Lucas." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. He could feel it, feel the presence in the room with him. The shadows were closing in, and there was nowhere to hide. Lucas tried to run, tried to get out, but the door wouldn't open. The handle turned in his hand, but the door wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, frantic, but the more he hit it, the more the room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on him. He was trapped. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A familiar face. Lucas's heart skipped a beat as the figure emerged from the shadows. The room seemed to pulse with a low hum, as though the very walls were alive, holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. He couldn't move, couldn't think, his body was locked in place, his limbs heavy, as though some unseen force was holding him in its grip. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. The dim light from the bedside lamp caught the edges of its features, and Lucas's breath caught in his throat. The face was familiar. It was his mother. But something was terribly wrong. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep into her skull, as though all life had been drained from her. Her skin was pale, a sickly, almost translucent shade, and her mouth was twisted into a grin that seemed too wide, too unnatural. It stretched across her face, exposing jagged, yellowed teeth. Her hair, once dark and silky, now hung in thin, stringy clumps around her face, matted with something dark, blood, oil. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Lucas knew this wasn't his mother. Not anymore. She stopped in front of him, her twisted smile never faltering. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that he could see his breath fogging in the air. His skin prickled with an icy chill, and the whispers from the walls grew louder, closer, as if they were surrounding him. "You shouldn't have come back, Lucas." The voice that came from his mother's lips was guttural, distorted, as though it was struggling to break through something ancient, something evil. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but his voice caught in his throat. His body refused to obey, paralyzed by a fear so deep, so primal, it felt like the very marrow in his bones was freezing. "This place, it never lets go," his mother's voice whispered, the words crawling into his ears like insects, wriggling beneath his skin. "It takes you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but shadows." Lucas's breath became shallow, and his vision blurred as the room seemed to pulse, the walls expanding and contracting like the chest of some great, unseen beast. His pulse pounded in his ears as the shadows in the room thickened, gathering in the corners, twisting, shifting, as if they were alive. Without warning, the door to his room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lock turned by itself, and he could hear the distinct sound of the doorknob rattling, as if someone, was on the other side. But it wasn't just the door. The whole room was closing in on him, the walls inching closer with every breath he took, suffocating him. And then, the lights went out. Total darkness. The kind that presses down on you, suffocating, absolute. The only thing Lucas could hear now was his own heartbeat, thumping louder and louder in his chest, as if it, too, was trying to escape. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound, an awful, scraping noise. Something heavy was dragging across the floor. Lucas's breath hitched as the sound grew closer, the dragging noise sending a cold shiver up his spine. It was coming from behind him, and he didn't dare turn around. The figure moved. His mother, or what had once been her, crept closer, dragging something across the floor, something heavy and wet. Lucas could hear it now, something large, something breathing. "You shouldn't have come back, Lucas," the voice repeated, now a raspy, inhuman rasp that scraped the air, like nails on a chalkboard. It was coming from all around him. "You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." The scraping stopped. The room was still, the darkness suffocating. Lucas's heart raced as he felt a cold presence moving behind him, brushing against his neck, a chill that seeped into his bones. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to cooperate, frozen in terror. He could feel something standing just behind him now, something close enough to touch, something, waiting. The silence stretched on, a thick, oppressive silence that weighed down on him like 1,000 pounds. And then, in the quiet, a whisper broke through the darkness. "You're not alone." The words were soft, but they sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Lucas's blood ran cold as he turned his head slowly, not daring to move too quickly. His gaze flicked to the corner of the room, where a shadow had begun to take form. It was moving. Not in the way a person moves, no, it was slower, more deliberate. The shape was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, too gangly. It moved like it was dragging itself, as though its bones were too heavy for its own body. The air felt thick, charged with something darker, something suffocating. The shadows themselves seemed to bend and stretch around the figure, as if they were alive, giving it shape. It was tall, too tall, and as it slithered closer, Lucas could feel his chest tighten, his lungs struggling for air. It stepped into the dim light of the room. And it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Hundreds of them. Dark, shifting shadows that were once human, his classmates, his friends, people he had known, but now twisted into grotesque, inhuman forms, their bodies contorted, their eyes hollow and black, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. They surrounded him. "You're not alone, Lucas." The voice came again, this time from every direction, every corner of the room. It echoed in his mind, rattling his skull. The figures closed in, their faces frozen in grotesque, silent expressions, their hands reaching for him, their fingers twisted and clawed. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The first one lunged. The room dissolved. Lucas's eyes snapped open, and he gasped for air, his body trembling violently. He was back in his room. The door was still locked. The lights were on. Everything seemed normal, but the silence was suffocating. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart thundering in his chest. He looked around, desperately scanning for any sign of movement, any hint of what had just happened. But the room was empty. For a moment, Lucas thought he might be losing his mind. Maybe it had all been a dream, a terrible, twisted nightmare that had felt too real. But deep down, he knew better. The feeling was still there. The whispers. The shadows. They were coming. And this time, there was nowhere to run. The air in Lucas's room was thick with an oppressive weight that felt impossible to ignore. The quiet hum of the fluorescent light overhead buzzed in his ears, but it wasn't the buzzing that bothered him, it was the silence that had settled around him, like a suffocating fog, creeping into every corner of his mind. His pulse was pounding in his throat, and every instinct in his body screamed for him to run. But where could he go? The door was locked. The windows, too, were sealed shut, the curtains drawn tight. It felt as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving him alone, trapped in this room with something far darker than his own fear. And yet, the worst part wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the cold or the strange feeling of being watched. It was the certainty that something was moving in the shadows. Lucas's breath caught in his chest as his eyes flicked to the corner of the room. For a split second, he could have sworn he saw something, a figure, barely visible, but there, just at the edge of his vision. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape shuddering like a mirage, flickering in and out of existence. But when he turned to face it directly, it was gone. It was never really there. But Lucas knew it had been. He knew what he'd seen. The same shadowy figures, the same dark presence that had tormented him in his dreams, in his waking hours. He wasn't alone. The thought gnawed at him, crawling under his skin. He could hear the whispering again, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was coming from everywhere, from the very walls, from the floor beneath him. It was like 1,000 voices all crying out in unison, speaking a language that he couldn't understand. But it didn't matter. The fear was there, settling in his chest, thick and suffocating. "You should never have come back." The voice was unmistakable. It was his mother's voice, but distorted, gurgling with an otherworldly rasp. The words were taunting him, mocking him, but it wasn't just the voice, there was something else, something in the way the shadows had begun to crawl across the walls. Something was changing. The room, the air, everything was shifting around him, warping into something unrecognizable. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tilt, just slightly, as though the very foundation of the building was buckling under an unseen weight. The walls, too, seemed to pulse, the patterns of paint and wallpaper rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Lucas stumbled back, his legs weak, but the shadows were already there, rushing toward him like a flood, moving faster than he could react. He turned toward the door again, but it was still locked, the doorknob unmoving in his hand. He could hear the scrape of claws on wood, dragging closer, and then the whisper came again, louder this time, urgent, desperate. "It's too late, Lucas. There's no way out now." His heart thundered in his chest as his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even move. His mind was frozen, paralyzed by the terror crawling over him, wrapping itself around his limbs, choking him. The shadows had already filled the room, their forms stretching and twisting like grotesque, disfigured creatures, reaching for him with long, spindly fingers. It's too late. Lucas's pulse quickened. He spun around, his eyes darting across the room in a frantic search for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the shadows pushing closer, suffocating him. He could feel them now, breathe them in, the chill that radiated from them. A coldness so intense it cut through his skin, sinking deep into his bones. His hands shook uncontrollably as he pressed them against the wall, desperate to keep his balance, to keep himself from collapsing under the weight of the terror consuming him. You can't hide. You can't escape. The words echoed, growing louder, more distorted. They came from all around him now, not just his mother's voice, but voices, dozens of them, whispering in unison. His mind reeled, his head spinning. He pressed his hands against his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside him, inside his head, filling every corner of his mind. And then, in the midst of the chaos, it happened. The door slammed open. Lucas barely had time to react before someone, stepped into the room. It was James. At first, Lucas thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The boy he had seen disappear, the friend he thought was lost, was standing in front of him. But this James wasn't the same. He was covered in what looked like black, tar-like veins, running up his arms, down his neck, twisting around his face. His eyes were black, like two voids, devoid of light, devoid of humanity. His mouth was open wide, but there were no words, only an unnatural, guttural growl that vibrated the air. "James," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. But James didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, dragging one foot behind him, like he was being pulled by something unseen. The movement was jerky, unnatural, like the boy wasn't walking of his own volition. Lucas could feel the presence in the room intensifying. The shadows, the whispers, they were all converging on him. He backed away, stumbling, his legs giving out beneath him, but James wasn't the only one there now. From the corner of the room, another figure emerged, this one even taller, more grotesque. It was a mass of shifting, writhing darkness, its shape barely humanoid, a hulking mass of shadow that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty pits, pools of darkness that seemed to swallow everything in their path. "You should have listened, Lucas," the voice hissed, its tone like the scrape of nails on glass. "You can't escape. Not from this." The shadows were closing in on him, wrapping around him, pulling him in. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. There was no way out. Lucas's hand shot out, grasping at the nearest object, a book, a lamp, anything, but nothing was solid. Everything was fading, shifting, warping in his hands like smoke slipping through his fingers. And then, just as the darkness was about to swallow him whole, there was a crack. A light, blinding, searing, burst from the center of the room, tearing through the shadows like a jagged spear. For a moment, Lucas thought he might be safe, that the light would banish the creatures, that it would set him free. But instead, the shadows shrieked in agony, recoiling from the light as if it were burning them. But it was too late. The darkness swallowed it whole. And then, everything went black. Lucas felt the cold touch of the void creep up his spine, the darkness pressing in from every side like a suffocating weight. The light, the fleeting hope that had burst forth in that final moment, was gone. Snuffed out. Everything was silent. Empty. And he was left alone in a room that felt like it no longer existed. His body trembled violently, his skin cold, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. The shadows had gone silent, but there was a deep, unsettling presence in the air, something far worse than silence. It was the kind of stillness that spoke of things that had no business being in the world, things that did not belong in this place, in this time. The shadows had returned. Lucas dared to open his eyes, but the darkness seemed to consume him, pulling him into a place where light couldn't reach, where time itself bent and broke. His breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale feeling like it might be his last. The weight in the air pressed down harder, and for a moment, Lucas thought he could hear his own heartbeat, thumping in his ears louder than ever. He looked around, but nothing made sense. The room that had once been his dorm was no longer recognizable. The walls were covered in a slick, black substance that seemed to pulse like a beating heart. The floor beneath him was cracked, splintered, as though the building itself was being torn apart by some unseen force. And in the corners of the room, the shadows shifted, curling and writhing like a living thing. And then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like distant voices on the wind. But they were getting closer. Louder. Until the sound filled his head, echoing inside him, crawling under his skin. "You can't hide, Lucas." The voice was familiar, but it was wrong, twisted, distorted. It came from behind him, like a breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive darkness that stretched out before him, the air thick with a cold that seemed to freeze his soul. But then, he saw it. It was James again. Only this time, James wasn't just standing there. He was crawling. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, his body jerking and twitching like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. His eyes were black pools of nothingness, his mouth stretched into a grin that was so wide, it almost seemed to split his face in half. "James." Lucas choked out, his voice trembling with fear. But James didn't respond. Instead, the boy tilted his head unnaturally to the side, his neck cracking with a sickening snap. The sound echoed in the empty room, but Lucas didn't have time to process it. He couldn't take his eyes off of James's hollow gaze, as if the boy were nothing more than a shell, a puppet with no soul. And then, without warning, James lunged. Lucas barely had time to react, stumbling backward as James's hands reached out toward him, fingers elongated and twisting like claws. The boy's mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with black ichor. Lucas screamed and pushed himself away, his heart racing as he scrambled toward the far side of the room. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, this time coming from everywhere, from the shadows, from the very air itself. "You are already ours." Lucas's chest tightened, and panic surged through his veins. His thoughts scattered, a chaotic storm of terror that drowned out everything else. He needed to run. He needed to get out of here. But there was nowhere to go. He turned toward the door, only to see it slowly, silently, closing in front of him, as if the very room was rejecting his existence. He ran toward it, but the closer he got, the more the room seemed to twist and bend. The walls were narrowing, closing in on him with every step he took. He could feel them, pressing against him, suffocating him. The shadows were everywhere now, no longer just watching, but reaching out, crawling toward him with malicious intent. The very air seemed to vibrate with their presence, their hunger. Lucas turned around, heart pounding in his chest, eyes wide with fear. And that's when he saw them. Hundreds of figures, no, not figures. Shadows. But they were no longer formless. No longer vague shapes in the dark. They had taken shape. They had taken form. Their faces, no, their faces, twisted and deformed, their eyes black pits of nothingness. Their mouths were stretched open, a grotesque parody of a human smile, exposing teeth too sharp, too long, to belong to anything natural. They were all around him now. "You belong to us," they whispered, the words dripping with malice. Lucas could feel the bile rising in his throat, the taste of fear so thick, it was suffocating. He backed away slowly, his legs shaking beneath him, but the figures followed. Step by step. Closer and closer. His thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. And then, he remembered. The window. Without thinking, Lucas bolted toward the window, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the latch. The glass was cold, slick with condensation, but the latch was stuck, refusing to open. He yanked harder, desperation overtaking him. The shadows were closing in now, their whispers louder, more insistent, their fingers brushing against his skin. "You cannot leave." With one final, frantic tug, the window gave way. The latch snapped open, and Lucas pushed it up with all the strength he had left. But the window didn't open fully. It was half open, just wide enough for him to see what was on the other side. What he saw made his stomach turn. Outside the window, beyond the safety of the room, stretched an endless void. A vast, swirling darkness that seemed to stretch on forever, consuming everything in its path. There was no world beyond that window. No ground. No sky. Just a never-ending chasm of blackness, empty and cold. And standing just outside the window, floating in the air, was the figure. It was tall, too tall. Its body was a mass of writhing shadows, tendrils of darkness twisting and coiling around itself. Its face was featureless, a smooth, pale mask of skin with deep, hollow eyes. The figure slowly raised a hand, long fingers reaching toward him, its touch chilling the air. And then it spoke. "There is no escape, Lucas. Not from us. Not from this place." The figure's voice was hollow, reverberating through Lucas's bones like an echo of death itself. In that moment, Lucas understood. This was not a nightmare. This was real. This was the end. The shadows surged forward. And Lucas screamed. Lena gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The forest stretched out around her, endless and dark, its shadows swallowing the road ahead. The engine hummed steadily, but the eerie silence surrounding her felt unnatural, too still. Her headlights barely cut through the dense trees, leaving everything beyond a blur of darkness. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure, standing just off the road, its features hidden by the thick fog. Lena's heart raced. She told herself it was just the mist, a trick of the night, but as she drove past, her rearview mirror showed something that made her blood run cold. The figure wasn't gone. It was closer. And it was moving toward her car. Lena had always loved the freedom that came with driving alone. There was something about the open road, the hum of her car's engine, that brought her a sense of peace. But tonight, something felt different. The road stretched out before her, winding through the dense forest like a dark ribbon in the night. The headlights barely pierced the inky blackness that surrounded her. She glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. Late, but she didn't mind. She was used to late-night drives, especially after a stressful week at work. The job had worn her down, and she needed this, just the silence, the empty road, and a chance to clear her head. But the further she drove into the forest, the more uneasy she became. The trees towered on either side of her, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air outside felt thick, almost suffocating, and she cracked the window a little to let in some cool air. The faint smell of damp earth filled the car, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her phone was dead, and there were no signs of civilization for miles. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter as she tried to shake off the unease. It was just the isolation getting to her, she reasoned. She was alone in a vast forest, nothing more. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A shadow. At first, she thought it was just the trees, their shapes distorting in the flickering light of her headlights. But as she passed it, she caught a glimpse of something more, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure. A woman, standing by the side of the road, her body still and unmoving. Lena's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind screamed for her to keep driving, to look straight ahead and not engage. But the woman's presence was impossible to ignore. She had long, dark hair, and her clothes, a tattered white gown, fluttered in the breeze, even though the air was eerily still. Lena's foot instinctively pressed on the brake. Her heart raced in her chest, the thudding growing louder with every passing second. She couldn't make sense of it. Who would be out here, alone, at this hour? The car skidded to a halt a few feet away from the figure. Lena sat there, frozen. Her eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, watching the woman in the dark gown. Nothing moved. She felt a chill creep up her spine. The woman wasn't looking at her, at least, not directly. Her head was tilted downward, her hair hiding her face. But there was something about the stillness, something unnatural about the way she stood there, that made Lena's skin crawl. A cold shiver ran down her back. Just a hitchhiker, Lena whispered to herself, trying to convince herself it was nothing. It's fine. It's fine. Just keep going. Her fingers were trembling as she reached for the gear shift, planning to drive off and forget this strange encounter. She glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, just to make sure the woman wasn't moving, wasn't going to chase after her, or do something strange. But when she looked back, the woman was gone. Lena blinked, staring at the empty road behind her. The figure had disappeared, vanished into the dark woods without a trace. Relief washed over her, followed quickly by confusion. Could she have imagined it? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her in the dark? Get a grip, she muttered to herself. It's just the forest, just your nerves. She pressed her foot back on the gas, slowly accelerating forward, eager to leave the unsettling encounter behind. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the further she drove, the more she felt that something wasn't right. Her hands gripped the wheel even tighter, her heart still pounding in her chest. She needed to focus, needed to get out of the woods. But then, it happened. A knock. Lena's eyes darted to the side. It wasn't the window, but the sound was unmistakable. It came from the passenger side, faint but there. Tap. 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 Lena froze, her blood running cold. She quickly looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. She glanced back at the passenger side. No one. Her breath came faster now, her pulse racing. She was alone. She had to be alone. She was in the car by herself, and yet. Tap. 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 The knocking came again. Her eyes shot to the side mirror, but there was no one standing outside. Her mind was playing tricks on her. She had to be imagining it. The sound couldn't have been real, could it? But it was. Tap. 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 Lena's head jerked around. The woman. The woman from before. She was standing by the passenger window now, her face still obscured by her long hair. Her heart nearly stopped in her chest. Without thinking, Lena slammed on the gas, her tires screeching as she sped away from the figure. The trees blurred by in a frenzy, but no matter how fast she drove, the shadows in the forest seemed to stretch longer, chasing after her, reaching out for her. She glanced back in the rearview mirror again, hoping for some kind of reassurance that it was just a trick of the light, just a figment of her imagination. But the woman wasn't in the mirror. At least, not where she had been. Instead, there was a figure in the middle of the road. Standing motionless. Lena's hands shook violently as she slammed the brake pedal to the floor. The car jerked to a stop just inches from the figure in the road. It was her. The woman. But this time, her hair was pulled back, revealing her pale, empty eyes staring straight at Lena. A voice, soft and cold as ice, whispered from the depths of the darkness. You shouldn't have come here, Lena. Lena's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. She knew that name. But how? She sat frozen in the car, her mind racing. The headlights flickered one last time, and the woman slowly stepped forward, her feet dragging across the gravel, her eyes never leaving Lena's. And then, the car engine died. Complete silence. The oppressive weight of the forest around her closed in. The woman was closer now, standing right next to the car. Lena's breath was shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she reached for the door handle, it was locked. No matter how hard she pulled, the door wouldn't open. The woman reached out with her pale, bony hand, her fingers brushing against the window. The last thing Lena saw before the lights went out was the reflection of her own terrified face in the glass. And then, darkness. Lena's body jolted awake with a sudden gasp, her heart hammering in her chest as if it were trying to break free. Her hands shot to her throat, grasping at the tightness that clung there. The air was thick, too thick. She felt suffocated. Her mind scrambled for a moment, fighting against the haze of confusion that clouded her thoughts. Where was she? The car. She was in the car. Her eyes snapped open, and for a split second, everything was still. The darkness enveloped her like a suffocating blanket, pressing against the windows, but the only sound she could hear was her own erratic breathing. The car's engine was silent. The forest outside was dead quiet, no wind, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. Nothing. Lena's pulse thudded in her ears as she turned her head toward the rearview mirror. Nothing. No woman, no shadow, no figure watching her from the road. The mirror reflected only her terrified, disheveled face. She blinked a few times, trying to make sense of it. The woman, had she imagined it? Was it a trick of the dark, a nightmare that bled into reality? Her fingers trembled as she slowly reached for the door handle, desperate to escape whatever nightmare had taken hold of her. But as she grasped it, something strange happened. The handle didn't budge. It was stuck, as though something was holding it from the outside. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The door was locked. She was sure she hadn't locked it. Her eyes darted to the other side of the car. There, she saw it, the faintest flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. Her body tensed, a primal fear flooding her veins. The woman. She was standing outside the driver's side window, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Lena's heart skipped a beat. How had she gotten there? How could she have moved so quickly without Lena noticing? The woman stood perfectly still, her face hidden in shadow, her body eerily motionless. The only thing Lena could make out was her long white gown, fluttering in the still air like the wings of a ghost. But that wasn't what terrified her the most. It was the feeling, this gut-wrenching sensation that the woman knew her, had always known her. Lena's hands gripped the steering wheel with desperation. She tried again to force the door open, but it was useless. Her body was trembling now, the fear coursing through her so intensely that it felt like an electric shock, a wave of terror that left her paralyzed. Tap. 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 The sound was soft, like the tapping of fingers against glass, but it was unmistakable. The window beside her. Lena's eyes flicked toward it, but she didn't dare look directly at it. She could feel the pressure, the weight of something unseen. Something watching her. Tap. 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 The knocking grew louder, closer, as though whoever was outside was just inches away, their breath fogging up the window, their presence crawling under her skin. She turned her head, finally meeting the window with a glance. There, just inches from her face, was the woman's face, pale and cold, her long hair tangled and wild, draping over her features like a dark curtain. The woman's eyes were wide open, but there was nothing in them, not a trace of life, not a glimmer of humanity. They were empty, hollow, like deep pits that swallowed all light. The breath caught in Lena's chest. Her throat closed up, and for a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't scream. Her entire body froze. The woman leaned closer to the glass, her mouth moving. Lena couldn't hear the words, but she could see them forming. Lips stretching into a thin, eerie smile. You shouldn't have come back. Lena's body shook uncontrollably. The words didn't make sense, not at first. She didn't understand. She hadn't been here before. She had never seen this woman before. She didn't know her. And yet, the woman's gaze, her words, carried a weight, like an accusation. Lena couldn't tear her eyes away. She felt as though she was being drawn into that gaze, into that emptiness. She reached for her phone, fumbled with it for a second, but it was dead. The screen remained black, mocking her helplessness. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the woman stepped back, fading into the darkness beyond the window. The cold, lifeless eyes remained locked onto Lena for just a moment longer, before she was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Lena sat there, staring at the empty space where the woman had been, her chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. She was paralyzed. Every rational thought was drowned out by the deep sense of dread that had now fully taken root in her mind. What was happening? Why was this happening to her? She slowly turned the key in the ignition. The car sputtered to life, the engine revving weakly at first, but then it steadied. She wiped the sweat from her brow, still unable to shake the feeling that she was being hunted, that the forest was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the forest beyond was pitch black. She could feel the darkness pressing in on all sides, as though it were closing in with every passing second. Lena pressed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. But her mind was racing, turning over every detail of what had just happened. The knocking on the window. The woman's face. The voice. It was all too real. Too personal. A sudden thought struck her, a chilling, impossible thought. What if she had been here before? She couldn't remember. She couldn't place it. But the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach wouldn't go away. She had to find out. She couldn't just leave. But as the road stretched on, and the trees seemed to loom closer and closer, the more the questions grew. What was she running from? Was she even running at all? Lena's grip on the wheel tightened again as she forced herself to keep driving, to keep moving. But with each mile, the air felt heavier. The silence felt deafening. And the longer she drove, the more she felt like something was chasing her, something that had always been with her, hidden in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. It was then that she saw it, a shape in the road ahead. A person. She slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. But this time, it wasn't a woman in a white gown. It was a man, standing motionless in the center of the road, his back turned toward her. He was tall, his figure outlined against the faint glow of the headlights. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What was this? Another figure? Was she losing her mind? Hey! Lena shouted, rolling down the window. What are you doing out here? The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. Lena's fingers gripped the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A cold sweat slicked down her back as she peered at the man, trying to make sense of him. She couldn't see his face. His clothes were dark, blending into the night, and his presence sent an overwhelming sense of dread flooding through her. Without thinking, she threw the car in reverse, her tires screeching as she sped backward. But before she could get more than a few feet away, she saw the man turn, his head snapping toward her. And that's when Lena realized, the face staring back at her was not a man's face at all. It was the woman's. The woman from before. Her hollow eyes locked with Lena's. And this time, the voice came clearer than ever, a cold whisper that cut through the air like ice. You can't leave. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she hit the gas, the car lurching forward. But the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, and in the corner of her eye, she could see the woman, not walking, but floating, as though gravity had no hold over her, following the car as it sped down the road. The road that never ended. And Lena knew then, the nightmare had only just begun. Lena's heart was pounding so hard that she could feel the blood rushing through her veins, a hot, terrifying tide that threatened to drown her. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her grip tight, as she fought to keep the car on the winding, lonely road. Every second, every flicker of movement in the shadows, sent her nerves into overdrive. The woman, no, the thing, was still out there. She didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know that it was following her. She could feel it. A presence, heavy and suffocating, pushing in on her from all sides. No matter how fast she drove, no matter how many curves the road took, the woman was always just behind her, lingering in the periphery of her senses. Lena glanced nervously at the dashboard, 3:05 a.m. Had she really been driving this long? It felt like hours, but nothing seemed to change. The trees, the darkness, the oppressive silence, everything remained the same. The road stretched on forever, like an endless loop, with no end in sight. Was this all in her head? The thought gnawed at her. Maybe she was just losing her mind. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on her. The shadows were just that, shadows. Her tired eyes were playing tricks. It had to be. It had to be. But then, as if on cue, a sharp, agonizing knock echoed from the back of the car. Tap. 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 Lena's entire body stiffened. The sound was so soft, so subtle, yet it cut through the stillness of the night like a blade. She gritted her teeth, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands shook as she forced herself to look into the rearview mirror. The woman. She was there, standing just behind the car, her pale face pressing against the glass. Her long, dark hair hung in loose strands around her face, and her eyes were wide, unblinking, empty, hollow sockets that seemed to reach into Lena's very soul. The woman's lips moved, but Lena couldn't hear anything over the roar of her own heartbeat in her ears. You can't run forever. Lena's breath hitched, and her chest tightened as the words whispered into her mind like a warning. A cold shiver ran down her spine, her skin prickling with dread. She didn't want to look away, but she couldn't tear her eyes off the mirror. The woman's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, a smile too wide to be human, her teeth yellow and sharp, glinting in the faint light of the dashboard. Lena slammed her foot on the gas pedal, her car lurching forward, the tires screeching as she fought to speed away. But the road never changed. It remained the same, endless and winding. The headlights sliced through the foggy darkness, but no matter how fast she went, she couldn't escape the shadows. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel as the landscape blurred by in a chaotic streak of dark trees and shadowy figures. She could feel them, watching her, those lurking things in the woods. Were they real? Were they even human? Tap. 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 The knocking came again, louder now, as if it were coming from inside the car. From the back seat. Lena's head whipped around, but there was nothing there. Only the empty, black space. And yet, she felt it, the weight of unseen eyes on her. The presence that had been following her since she entered the forest was now inside the car with her. Her breath came faster, panic rising in her chest like a tidal wave. She could feel her mind starting to crack under the pressure. The car's engine hummed louder, but the air inside was thick, suffocating. It was as if the walls were closing in on her. The trees outside had become twisted, their branches clawing at the sky in unnatural shapes. Everything felt wrong. You can't leave. You can't escape. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent, and Lena's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the woman outside anymore. It was inside her head, crawling beneath her skin, seeping into her thoughts. The words felt like a truth, like a prophecy she couldn't outrun. She swerved, narrowly avoiding a tree that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Her hands were slick with sweat as she tried to regain control of the car. The headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. This time, the woman was inside the car. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her head tilted to one side, staring at her with those dark, empty eyes. The smell of decay and something foul filled the air, thick and suffocating, as though the woman hadn't been alive for years. Lena's chest tightened, and her heart pounded erratically. She could hear her own pulse now, loud and frantic. "Get out of the car," the woman whispered, her voice rasping, as though it hadn't been used in ages. "You don't belong here, Lena." Lena's body froze. She didn't know what to do. Her mind was a mess of terror and confusion. She wasn't supposed to be here. This road wasn't meant for her. This woman wasn't meant for her. The woman's mouth stretched wide, that twisted, unnerving smile pulling her features apart. Her hands were ghostly white, thin and long, reaching out from the shadows. They grabbed at the back of Lena's seat, pulling herself closer. Lena screamed, her voice breaking through the madness in her head, and she slammed the car into reverse. Her tires spun violently, and the car lurched backward. The woman was still there, her hollow eyes fixed on Lena, her smile never faltering. The road didn't end. The car didn't move fast enough. The trees closed in tighter, and Lena realized, with a sickening jolt, that there was no escape. She was trapped on this road, this endless stretch of darkness, of horror, and no matter how fast she drove, no matter how hard she tried to break free, she could never outrun what was chasing her. She glanced to her left. In the blur of the passing trees, something stood out, something that didn't belong. There, just for a split second, a flash of light. She turned the wheel sharply, her heart racing as she focused on it, desperate for something familiar. Her eyes widened when she saw it. A sign. It was small, battered by years of neglect, but it was there. A sign that read, "Dead End." Lena's stomach churned. She wasn't at the end. She was nowhere near the end. She was stuck. Trapped. And as she looked ahead, the trees seemed to close in on her, the road narrowing until it was almost impossible to see. And then, through the misty fog and thick darkness, a figure appeared at the edge of the road. A man. Tall, faceless, his figure clothed in dark rags. He didn't move, just stood there, staring out at her, his empty, soulless eyes fixed on hers. Lena screamed again, but the sound was swallowed up by the dead air around her. She stepped on the brake, but it felt like the car was sinking, its tires spinning on invisible ground. The car stopped, and for a moment, everything was eerily still. A single figure, standing outside the car. And then, tap, tap, tap. The knocking was back. Lena turned her head, and for a moment, the world stood still. She was no longer in control. There was no escape. There was no place to run. The shadows had already closed in. The woman's face, pale and empty, appeared once again in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. And then, the woman's voice whispered once more, louder than ever before. "You will never leave this road. You will never leave this forest. You are ours." The darkness closed in around her, and Lena realized, too late, that she was not just on a road through a forest. She was on a road to nowhere. A road that would never end. And there was no escape. The car was still. Silent. The only sound Lena could hear was the pounding of her heart in her chest, its rhythm chaotic and erratic. Her breathing was shallow, as though each inhale was a struggle. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. Every part of her body screamed for her to act, to do something, anything, but her limbs were frozen. The cold sweat on her skin chilled her to the bone. The oppressive silence surrounding her was worse than the terror itself. She wanted to scream, to tear the doors open and run until her legs gave out. But no matter how hard she fought to lift her hand from the steering wheel, her muscles betrayed her. The fear was like a physical weight pressing down on her, crushing her from every direction. The woman was still in the rearview mirror. Her face was a twisted mask of pale flesh, eyes wide open and unblinking, staring into Lena's soul with an emptiness that chilled her to her core. The longer Lena stared at the woman, the more she felt herself being drawn into that vacant gaze, her mind slipping into a haze where the only thing that mattered was the woman, whoever she was, whatever she was. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until Lena's eyes darted to the side. The shadow, the tall, faceless man, was gone. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The air in the car felt colder now. The windows had fogged up, and the atmosphere inside was thick with something unnatural. A deep, unsettling quiet. There was something in the air, something Lena couldn't explain. Then, it happened. A faint rustling sound, almost imperceptible, came from the back seat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something inside the car. Something moving. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She felt her chest tighten as she slowly turned her head, afraid of what she would find. Her fingers dug into the seat, her body rigid with terror. The back seat was empty, nothing but shadows. But the rustling continued. Tap. 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 It was the same sound, the same soft, eerie tapping, like fingers tapping against the back window. Lena's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and rapid as she dared another glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. But the sound persisted. Lena's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She didn't know what she was going to do if she opened it. There was nowhere to go. The trees, the road, the forest, it all felt like it was closing in on her. But her instincts were screaming at her. She had to get out. Her hand brushed the door handle, but before she could turn it, a shadow moved in the rearview mirror. It was fast, sudden, a dark figure crossing the back seat. Her heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, she slammed her foot on the accelerator, the car jerking forward with a jolt. She didn't even care about the road anymore. She just needed to move. She just needed to get away from whatever that thing was in the back seat. But the headlights seemed to fade, like they were being swallowed up by the darkness around her. The road ahead was barely visible now. The trees, once so thick and menacing, now seemed to blur together, like dark, shifting shapes. Lena's hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, her breath coming faster. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She tried to focus on the road, but the corners of her vision kept flickering with shapes, figures in the shadows. They moved too quickly for her to fully see, but she could feel them. Then, the tapping started again, closer now. Louder. Tap. 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 Lena's eyes darted to the rearview mirror once more, but this time, there was something different. The woman wasn't just standing there. She was in the back seat. Her eyes were locked on Lena's, unblinking, hollow. The smile that spread across her face was slow, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. The woman didn't move, but the sheer presence of her was suffocating. The tapping stopped. Lena couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. Her mouth felt dry, her chest tight with fear. The woman's face was inches from her, but there was no sound, no breath. Just the darkness between them. Then, the woman spoke. "You can't outrun it, Lena." The voice was a rasp, like a whisper in her ear, but it was so cold that it felt like ice was crawling under her skin. Her name, Lena, sounded so foreign when the woman said it, as if the word itself was poison. Lena couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the woman's eyes, from that unnerving smile. Her mind was spiraling, she had to move. She had to get away. The woman's smile grew wider, impossibly wide. Her teeth were jagged and yellow, her lips stretching far beyond what should have been possible. "You should have stayed away," the woman whispered. "Now, you'll never leave." Lena's heart slammed against her ribcage. She reached for the door again, her hands shaking violently, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. Her pulse quickened as she slammed her fist against the window, desperate for any way out. But it was no use. She was trapped. The woman's smile deepened as she leaned closer, her breath cold against Lena's skin. Lena couldn't take it anymore. She had to get out. With one last surge of panic, she hit the gas pedal harder than she ever had before, her foot pressing down with all the force she could muster. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring as the tires screeched against the pavement. But the forest didn't move. The road didn't end. The headlights flickered once more. The woman was gone, no trace of her in the back seat. Lena's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to tell herself it was all just a trick. A hallucination. But then she saw it. The road ahead was gone. The trees seemed to have swallowed it whole. There was no path anymore, no road leading her anywhere. It was as though the forest itself had consumed the world around her. The trees towered, their branches stretching toward the sky, blocking out everything. The fog had thickened to an unnatural degree, curling around the car in ghostly tendrils, and the darkness was endless. Lena slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. Her heart dropped into her stomach as she stared ahead, her eyes wide with disbelief. There was nothing. No end to the road. No sign of civilization. No sign of anything. She was alone in the forest, but it wasn't just the forest. The world around her had turned into a maze, an endless labyrinth. No matter how far she drove, she would never escape. Lena opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was dry. Her mind was a jumble of confusion and fear. But then, a sound. A whisper, so faint, so far away, but it chilled her to the bone. "We told you. You can't leave." Lena's eyes shot to the rearview mirror again, but the woman wasn't there. The back seat was empty. The car was silent. And yet, Lena knew, deep in her bones, that she wasn't alone. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The road was endless. And so was the terror. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she sat frozen in the car, staring ahead at the pitch-black nothingness that surrounded her. The forest had swallowed the road. The road she had been following for what felt like an eternity was gone. The car was alone now, stranded in a place that didn't feel real, a place that felt wrong. Every breath she took seemed to echo in the dense silence, and every rustling of leaves outside made her jump. It wasn't just the road that had vanished. It was the world itself. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the empty expanse in front of her. The headlights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across the fog-cloaked ground. Her fingers clutched the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the tremors in her hands nearly making her lose her grip. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Something was out there. Watching her. She was out there. The woman. Lena's skin crawled as her thoughts spiraled. What was this? What was happening to her? She had been driving down that road, thinking she would get to the next town, thinking that everything would be fine. But now, everything was a nightmare, a web of confusion and fear, and Lena was stuck in the center of it. The fog outside pressed in against the car, thickening until she could barely see past the windshield. It was as if the trees were closing in on her, inch by inch, making the forest feel like a prison. Her mind raced, trying to grasp at some sort of explanation, but there was nothing, nothing logical, nothing grounded. Every thought slipped through her fingers like sand. Suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness. A tapping. Soft at first, barely audible. It came from the back window, but it wasn't the gentle tap-tap-tap of someone's fingers. It was a rhythmic, deliberate knocking, like something trying to get her attention. Lena froze. The air around her grew cold, thick with an unnatural chill that seeped into her bones. The tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever it was behind her was desperate. Tap. 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 Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but there was no reflection. Nothing behind her. Just blackness. The mirror was a void. But then, the mirror seemed to distort. It shimmered, like water rippling in the moonlight. Her stomach flipped. Her skin tingled with an electric, icy sensation. Lena's breath hitched, her mind screaming at her to turn around, but her body refused to move. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bear to face what was behind her. She knew. She just knew. The tapping stopped. And for a moment, everything was dead quiet. But then, it came again. This time, the sound was closer, too close. The tapping was now inside the car. Tap. 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 Lena's heart pounded violently in her chest. She felt as though her blood was ice, every vein frozen with fear. The darkness outside pressed in harder, suffocating the air around her. In the rearview mirror, a face appeared. Lena gasped, her hands shaking as she whipped her head around. The woman. The same woman. Her face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over her bones, her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin that pulled her lips back far too far. The woman's eyes were wide, wide enough that they seemed to swallow the rest of her face. There was no humanity left in those eyes, just an endless void. Her long, matted hair hung in strands like dead vines, clinging to her hollow cheeks. Lena opened her mouth to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The woman's mouth moved, the words coming out in a hollow rasp. "You've been here before." Lena's blood ran cold. What? The woman's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, and Lena couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing in the mirror. "You've been here before," the woman repeated, her voice growing louder, a jagged sound that scraped against Lena's sanity. Lena shook her head, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. She had never been here before, she had just driven into this forest, thinking it was a shortcut. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But the woman's voice pierced through her thoughts again, deeper this time, as though it was coming from inside her skull. "You've been here before, Lena. You've been down this road. And you'll never leave." Lena slammed her foot on the gas pedal, her eyes darting to the road ahead. But there was no road. No path. Just endless trees and shadows. The car jerked forward as if it was being pulled, dragged by some unseen force. The steering wheel jerked violently to the left, and Lena's hands were pulled along with it, forcing the car into a sharp turn. Her heart raced. She couldn't control the car. It felt like it was alive, like something else was driving it, controlling it. A dark shape appeared in front of her, emerging from the fog. A figure. Lena's foot slammed harder on the gas, but the figure was growing closer. She couldn't stop. She couldn't turn away. It was a man. Tall. His face obscured by a hood. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of the road, as if waiting for her. Waiting for the car to reach him. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick fog. She gritted her teeth, her hands fighting for control of the wheel, but the car was moving as if it had a mind of its own. The figure was getting closer, his silhouette growing larger in the headlights. There was nowhere to go. Lena slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It was as if the road had vanished beneath her, the car continuing to slide forward as though gravity no longer applied. The figure was inches away now, just a few feet from the front of the car. His face remained hidden beneath the hood, but Lena could feel his presence, as though he were watching her with an intensity that made her blood freeze. And then, it happened. The car hit the figure. The impact was sudden, jarring, and for a moment, everything went dark. The car swerved violently, spinning out of control. Lena's stomach lurched as she was thrown forward, the seatbelt digging into her chest. The car finally came to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying. The fog outside was thicker than ever, the air cold and suffocating. Lena's heart was pounding in her ears, her head spinning as she struggled to regain control of her senses. She couldn't breathe. Her eyes darted around the fogged-up car. The figure, had it disappeared? She didn't know. All she could hear was her own frantic breathing, the silence of the forest pressing in on her. Then, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. A low moan. Lena turned her head slowly, her breath hitching in her throat. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw the figure standing just outside the car, inches away from the window. His hood was still pulled low over his face, but his hand was pressed against the glass. A pale, withered hand. Fingers too long. Too thin. Lena's body went rigid, every muscle locked in terror. The man moved closer. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, but Lena could feel his eyes on her. She could feel them. Suddenly, his voice, a rasping, hollow voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the earth, pierced the silence. "You can't leave. Not again. You're part of this place now." The words echoed in her mind, repeating, swirling around her. She tried to move. But it was too late. The world outside the car twisted, the trees bending toward her as if they were alive. The fog thickened, and everything around her seemed to close in. The car, her only lifeline, felt like it was being consumed by the darkness. And in that moment, Lena understood. She wasn't lost in the forest. She was trapped. Trapped in a place that had no beginning, no end. A place where time didn't exist, where the road had no destination. She was part of the forest now. Part of the nightmare. And she would never leave. The truth was, she had never been here before. Not until now. And now, the forest was hers. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she sat frozen in the car, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. The fog outside pressed in like an oppressive weight, smothering everything around her. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure standing just outside the window, his withered, pale hand still pressed against the glass. His fingers were impossibly long, stretched like gnarled branches reaching toward her, and every part of her body screamed to run, but her limbs refused to move. The car felt like a prison. The air inside was thick with a suffocating cold that made her teeth chatter. She could barely think straight, her mind a swirl of panic and confusion. Her body refused to obey her commands. She wanted to scream, to drive away, but it was as if the world around her had turned to stone. The man, if that was even what he was, stood there, unmoving. His face was still hidden beneath the dark hood, but Lena could feel his gaze piercing through her, a presence so overwhelming that it felt like he was inside her head, crawling beneath her skin. The feeling of his eyes on her was suffocating, like they were ripping into her very soul. "You can't escape," his voice rasped from the darkness, his words like a cold whisper inside her mind. The sound wasn't coming from his mouth, it was coming from everywhere. From the trees, from the fog, from the very air itself. Lena's heart skipped a beat, and her hands clenched the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Escape? She shook her head in disbelief. She had to escape. She had to get out of here. But no matter how much she tried to move, the car wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. She pressed her foot on the gas, but nothing happened. The car was stuck, like a prisoner in a cage. The man's voice came again, slow and deliberate, as though savoring each word. "You'll never leave this place, Lena. You'll never leave me. You're mine now." Lena's skin crawled at the words. They weren't just a warning. They were a curse. Terror gripped her chest as she turned her head toward the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, no sign of the woman, no trace of anything. The mirror reflected nothing but the fog and the shadows that swallowed the car whole. But then, it shifted. The reflection distorted, the surface rippling like water. And there she was. The woman. Her face was twisted, more grotesque than before. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to devour the light, and her mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, her teeth sharp and jagged, like the fangs of some animal. Lena recoiled, her pulse pounding in her ears as the woman leaned forward, her breath fogging up the mirror. "You can't leave, Lena," the woman's voice whispered. It was like a lullaby, soft and sweet, but laced with something dark, something sinister. "You're here for good. You belong to the forest now." Lena's throat tightened, panic rising like a tide. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The walls of the car felt like they were closing in on her. The woman's face was getting closer, and Lena's heart raced, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of it all. She wasn't just stuck in the car. She wasn't just lost in the fog. Something far darker was happening. The fog outside shifted again, and something moved. A shadow. A figure. Lena's eyes darted to the window. Her heart nearly stopped as the man was gone, vanished from sight. But the feeling that he was still there, standing just outside, watching her, was overwhelming. It was as if the very air around her had thickened with his presence. Her pulse quickened, her chest tight with the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The tapping started again. Soft at first, barely a whisper in the stillness. Tap. 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 But this time, it wasn't coming from the back window. It was coming from the roof of the car. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Tap. 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 A steady rhythm, like something clawing its way across the roof. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, her mind screaming at her to get out, to run. But the door was locked. She frantically twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The car wouldn't let her go. It was as though the very vehicle itself had become a part of this place, and it wasn't going to let her leave. The tapping on the roof grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to get inside. The sound echoed in her ears, growing faster, more erratic, until it felt like the entire car was vibrating. The walls of the car seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the tapping, the air thick with the weight of it. Suddenly, the car jolted forward, as though it had been pushed. Lena's body lurched against the seatbelt, her stomach rising into her throat. The headlights flickered to life, casting long, jagged shadows on the fog-covered road ahead. The trees seemed to lean closer, their twisted branches reaching out like hands, pulling the car deeper into the forest. Lena slammed on the brakes, but the car wouldn't stop. It slid forward, as if the wheels had been frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far stronger than gravity. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror again, and this time, the woman was standing in the back seat. Her eyes locked onto Lena's. There was no escape now. The woman's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it was no longer a smile, it was a gaping maw, a hole of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the woman's lips parted, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Do you feel it?" the woman whispered, her voice like a snake slithering into Lena's ear. "The hunger. The pull. You're one of us now, Lena. You always have been." Lena's stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out on her skin. She slammed her foot onto the gas again, desperate for movement, desperate to escape. But the woman's voice filled the car, drowning out everything else. "You can run. You can scream. But you'll never be free. This place has claimed you, Lena. Just like it claimed all the others." The trees outside the window seemed to blur together, their twisted limbs bending unnaturally as the fog closed in around her. The car was moving now, but it wasn't moving towards safety. It was moving towards something darker, something that Lena could feel clawing at her insides. The car lurched forward again, this time with a sickening, grinding sound, as if the road itself was being torn apart. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick fog. Her eyes darted to the dashboard. Nothing was working. The speedometer was stuck at 0. The gas gauge was empty. The car was running on nothing. Then, through the fog, she saw it. A building. A structure. It was a house, old, dilapidated, the windows broken and shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. It was a place that shouldn't exist, a place that felt like it had been abandoned for centuries. But there it was, standing at the end of the twisted road, like it had always been there, waiting for her. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as the car skidded to a stop in front of the house. The engine cut out, leaving only the echo of her breath in the silence. She sat there, staring at the house, her body frozen in place, too terrified to move. The door to the house creaked open. Lena's blood ran cold as a figure stepped out onto the porch. It was the man, the one with the hood. But this time, there was no hiding his face. His eyes were empty sockets, black as night, and his skin was pale and cracked, like the bark of a dead tree. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. It was as if he was waiting for her to come to him. Lena's mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The fog thickened, curling around the car, and she knew, deep in her bones, that she had no choice. The woman's voice filled the car again, sweet and taunting. "You're home now, Lena. You belong to us." Lena's hand slowly reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she felt the cold metal beneath her fingertips. She knew she couldn't escape. Not now. Not ever. The house was waiting. And so was the darkness inside. Lena's heart pounded so loudly in her ears it was all she could hear. The car sat silent in front of the house, but the stillness around her felt suffocating, as if the very air was alive, pressing in from all sides. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the car like an inescapable shroud, leaving her with no way out. The man stood in the doorway of the dilapidated house, his empty sockets staring at her, as though waiting for her to move, to make the first step toward her doom. The woman's laughter echoed in her mind, sweet, cruel, and unnerving. It was almost comforting, in a twisted sense, as if she were being invited home. But it wasn't comfort. It was a trap, a deception. Everything about this place, this dark, forgotten stretch of road, was designed to drag her deeper into its malevolent embrace. Lena swallowed, her throat dry. Her eyes flickered between the house and the man, her body frozen with terror. The fog clung to her skin, heavy and suffocating, its chill gnawing at her bones. It was almost as if the fog had become sentient, aware of her every movement, every breath. Her thoughts were clouded with the creeping sensation that something terrible was watching her from the depths of that house, from the very walls themselves. No. She can't stay here. But her limbs were stiff, unyielding. The fear that coursed through her veins turned her body into stone, her mind hazy with the weight of the truth she had yet to face. She had no choice. The man, still standing motionless in the doorway, finally took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His feet made no sound as they touched the ground, his body moving with an unnatural fluidity. With each step, Lena felt the air grow heavier, her body shivering, the chill creeping down her spine like icy fingers. Her eyes darted toward the rearview mirror, praying for some sign, some way out. But there was nothing. The back seat was empty, the fog swallowing everything else. It was like the world had shrunk to just her, the car, and the man slowly advancing toward her. He's coming closer. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't breathe. The fog was thick now, blotting out everything else. It wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside the car, swirling through the open windows. Every breath felt like she was inhaling poison, each gulp of air suffocating her just a little more. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, but the car remained immobile. The engine had long since died, leaving her stranded. She slammed her fist against the dashboard in frustration, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence, but it made no difference. The man was just a few steps away now, his shadow stretching across the gravel toward her like a dark, crawling thing. His head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement that felt wrong, as if his neck wasn't meant to bend that way. Lena felt the urge to scream, but no sound came out. Her mouth was dry, paralyzed by the terror. He was there. At her window. His face was a pale mask, the skin taut and decayed, hanging in ragged folds like old, cracked leather. His eyes, those empty, dark sockets, seemed to stare into her very soul. Lena could feel the weight of his gaze, pulling at her mind, stripping away her thoughts, until she was left with nothing but raw, primal fear. The air in the car grew colder still, and she shivered uncontrollably. The man's mouth opened, revealing the same jagged, inhuman teeth she had seen before in the woman's smile. They were sharp, twisted, like the fangs of some predatory creature that had long since learned to live off fear. The man didn't speak, but his presence alone sent a wave of nausea crashing through Lena's chest. Lena tried to tear her gaze away, but it was as if her body refused to obey. Her eyes were locked on his. She could hear him in her head now, a voice that wasn't his, but a chorus, all of them whispering in unison. "You're ours. You're here forever." The words slithered through her mind, filling her thoughts with a gnawing dread, an awareness of her fate that sank deep into her gut. She wanted to close her eyes, to block out the horror, but the sound of her own breath, shallow and frantic, reminded her that she couldn't look away. Not now. Something shifted in the air. The fog, now thick as soup, pressed against the windows, making it feel as though the world outside had disappeared entirely. The trees had vanished, the road was gone. It was as if the entire universe had contracted to this single point in time, Lena, the man, and the house that stood like a tomb waiting to swallow her whole. A sudden scream pierced the air, a voice that sent chills down her spine. Lena's body jolted in the seat, her hands flying to her ears, but it did nothing. The scream wasn't outside. It was inside her head. It was her own scream. She didn't realize it until the world around her began to distort, morphing into something darker. The car's interior seemed to bend, the edges warping and melting like wax. The walls were closing in, the seatbelt choking her as the air grew dense, suffocating. And then the voice came again, but this time it was louder, clearer, and more personal. "You're never leaving. Never." Lena gasped, clutching her chest as her vision blurred. Her body felt light, detached from the seat, as though she was being lifted from the car by an unseen force. The fog seeped through the open windows, curling around her, pulling her toward the dark house like a tidal wave. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, but not just around her body, around her mind. The door of the house creaked open again, and Lena saw something, someone, standing there. Another figure, but this one was no longer human. Its form shifted, blurry, like a mirage, its face a contorted mask of agony. The figure beckoned to her, its fingers long and skeletal, a silent invitation to her doom. Lena's body moved against her will. Her hands unlocked the car door, and she stumbled out into the fog, her feet dragging her forward. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to leave the car, but it wasn't her decision anymore. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by something far beyond her understanding. The house loomed before her, the doorway dark and inviting. Her feet carried her closer, even as her mind screamed for her to stop. The fog swallowed her, enveloping her in its cold, suffocating grip. She could barely see, her vision fading to black as she took another step, and then another. The door swung open with a groan, and Lena was drawn inside. The last thing she heard was the soft whisper in her ear, just before everything went dark. "You were always meant to be here." And then, there was nothing. 3 friends. 1 hotel. A night that was supposed to be just another shift. But when they heard the whispers from the empty dining room, they didn't realize what was waiting for them in the shadows. They thought it was just a normal job, but the longer they worked, the more they realized something terrifying was hidden beneath the hotel's charm. What if the place you worked in never let you leave? Have you ever lived in a place that felt alive? A place where the silence wasn't peaceful, but suffocating? Emma and Nathan thought they had found their sanctuary, but the house they moved into had its own secrets. And the more they tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to reach out to them. What if the walls you thought were keeping you safe were actually trapping you? What if the home you trusted wasn't yours at all? Tonight, the line between reality and terror will blur, and the truth they uncover will change everything. Are you ready to hear it? Because once you do, you'll never look at your own home the same way again. Emma and Nathan had spent years dreaming of a quiet life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They had both grown tired of the noise, the crowded streets, and the relentless pace of their lives. So, when they found the perfect farmhouse, tucked away at the edge of a sprawling forest, it felt like fate had brought them here. It was everything they had ever wanted, peaceful, secluded, and far enough from civilization to make them feel truly alone. But that quiet? It was different. Not the peaceful, calm silence they had imagined. No. It was something heavier. Like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. When they first moved in, everything had seemed perfect. The house was old, but solid. The wood creaked underfoot, and the walls whispered with the weight of years gone by. There was an air of history here, memories left behind by previous owners who had long since disappeared. It gave the house a certain charm. They both felt drawn to it. It felt safe, in a way. But it wasn't long before things started to change. It started small. Nothing alarming at first, just odd little details that didn't quite add up. A door left ajar when they were sure they'd closed it. A light flickering for no reason. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to shift when they weren't looking. At first, Emma thought it was just her imagination running wild. She dismissed it as the stress of moving, adjusting to a new place. Nathan, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. It's an old house, Em. It's gonna make noise. We're just not used to it yet. But Emma wasn't so sure. There were moments when the silence felt wrong. Like something was watching her, waiting. One night, about a week after they'd moved in, Emma couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin crawl. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. Her mind raced, chasing thoughts she couldn't catch. And then, just when she thought she might finally drift off, she heard it. A faint whisper. Barely audible, but distinct enough to send a chill down her spine. Emma. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was soft, almost like a breeze, but it was unmistakably clear. It came from somewhere in the room, yet when she turned her head, there was nothing, no one. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she sat up in bed, looking around the dark room. Nathan was still asleep beside her, his chest rising and falling steadily. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in around her. The house, so full of life and energy during the day, now felt empty, as if it were holding some unspoken secret. She shook her head, trying to shake the feeling. It's just the wind, she whispered to herself. It's nothing. But then the whisper came again. Louder this time. Emma. Her breath caught in her throat. The air felt suddenly thick, suffocating. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and unlocked it, the soft glow of the screen barely cutting through the darkness. The time read 2:34 a.m. Too late for anyone to be awake, except for her. The whisper had stopped, but the tension in the room hadn't. It was like the air had been drawn tight, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Nathan, she whispered, but the words felt small in the dark. He didn't stir. His breathing was slow and even, completely unaware of the unsettling feeling that was crawling under Emma's skin. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out of the room, to escape the oppressive stillness that seemed to have taken hold. She stood up, her feet padding softly across the floor, and walked toward the door. As she reached the handle, she froze. From the other side of the room, in the darkness near the corner, there was a low, creaking sound, like a door slowly opening. Emma's heart leapt into her throat. She knew the door was shut. She remembered closing it. And yet, now it was ajar. Just a crack. She stepped back, her pulse racing. Her mind screamed for her to run, to leave the room and never look back. But curiosity, that gnawing, insistent curiosity, kept her rooted to the spot. She took a slow, hesitant step forward. The floor creaked beneath her, and her breath caught. Another creak. This time, closer. She spun around, expecting to see Nathan awake, but he was still in a deep, peaceful sleep. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, elongating with every passing second. Something was wrong. And then, from the far end of the hallway, she heard it again. A voice. Not a whisper this time, but a soft, drawn-out murmur. Emma. Her skin crawled. The voice was unmistakable now, it was coming from inside the house. Someone, or something, was calling her. Her feet moved of their own accord. She didn't want to go toward the sound, but her body was already halfway down the hallway before she could stop herself. The floor creaked again. And then, from the darkness of the living room, came another sound. A low, scraping noise, something being dragged across the floor. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. Nathan, she whispered again, her voice shaky, but the words came out too quietly. She stepped into the living room, and the air was colder here, much colder than it should be. The room was bathed in the faint glow of moonlight, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. The house felt like it was holding its breath, the silence so thick it was almost suffocating. Then she saw it. A shape in the corner of the room. Something, or someone, was standing there, just out of reach of the light. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind scrambled to make sense of what she was seeing. It was tall, its outline obscured by the shadows, but there was something unnerving about it. Something that made her want to run. Before she could take another step, the figure turned. Slowly. Deliberately. It was a person. But it wasn't Nathan. The figure stepped forward, revealing pale, gaunt features, its eyes hollow and dark. Its mouth stretched into a twisted, unnatural grin. And then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't Nathan's. Emma. The whisper. The voice. It was calling her again. But this time, there was no mistaking it. She wasn't alone. And whatever it was that stood before her, wasn't human. Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure, no, the thing, stood there in the darkness, its pale face impossibly still. Her heart hammered in her chest as her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. She wasn't sure if she was still dreaming, but the cold, the fear, the terrible sensation of being watched, it felt all too real. It took a step forward. The air seemed to grow colder, the temperature in the room dropping by degrees. Emma could see her breath now, misting in front of her as if the temperature had plunged into winter in an instant. She opened her mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry, tight, she could barely breathe, let alone yell for Nathan. She glanced back toward the hallway, praying that he would wake up, that he would hear her, that he would come to save her from whatever this thing was. But Nathan was still asleep, undisturbed by the terror unfolding just steps away from him. Emma wanted to run, to flee the house, to leave it all behind. But her legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. Every part of her screamed for her to get out of there, but her body wouldn't obey. She couldn't move. The thing, it wasn't a person anymore. The more Emma looked at it, the more she realized it was something else entirely. Its skin was stretched too thin, its features too sharp, too hollow. The eyes, it had no pupils, just deep, dark sockets that seemed to consume all the light around it. Its smile widened unnaturally, stretching across its face in a way that made Emma's stomach twist in horror. "Emma," it said again, the word dragging from its throat like a whisper through broken glass. The voice wasn't human, but it had the same lilt as Nathan's, a mockery of his voice, twisted into something sinister. Her pulse raced as she backed away, bumping into the wall behind her. The thing didn't move, but its eyes followed her, unblinking. It was as if it was waiting for something. Emma didn't know what it wanted, but every instinct inside her screamed that it was something she didn't want to find out. "Stay away from me," she finally managed to gasp, her voice shaking with fear. The thing tilted its head slightly, as if amused by her words. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it reached up, its long, skeletal fingers grazing the air. The room seemed to grow darker, as if the shadows were reaching toward it, eager to obey. Emma's breath hitched. The air felt thick now, almost suffocating. It was as if the house itself had turned against her, closing in around her, drawing her in like a trap. She tried to run, but her legs were still frozen, unresponsive. And then, to her horror, she realized something. The house wasn't just silent, it was listening. The walls had ears. The thing took another step forward, and Emma's heart lurched. It was closer now, much closer. She could feel its cold presence pressing into her, suffocating her. Her chest tightened as if the very air was being sucked out of the room. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing stopped. Its eyes, those dark, empty pits, stared directly at her, unblinking. The silence stretched on, stretching to a point where Emma thought she might lose her mind from the sheer weight of it. And then, with a voice that chilled her to her very bones, it spoke again. "You can't leave. Not yet." The words felt like a command, like a promise. The smile on its face twisted wider, impossibly wide, stretching almost to its ears. It didn't need to say anything else. It was clear. The house, whatever it was in control. And Emma was trapped. Her thoughts raced, but no coherent plan formed. She needed to get Nathan, needed to wake him. But how? She couldn't move. The thing was so close now, she could feel its breath, cold as death, brushing against her skin. What is it?" Nathan's voice startled her out of her thoughts. She turned quickly, finally able to tear her gaze away from the thing in the corner. Nathan was standing in the hallway, blinking as he tried to shake off the grogginess of sleep. "What's going on?" The thing in the corner let out a low, guttural chuckle. "He can't help you," it rasped, its voice now a hideous blend of human and something else, something far more ancient, far darker. Emma felt her body tense, her heart pounding. "Nathan, get out of here, please, run," she screamed, but her voice cracked, barely audible over the oppressive silence of the house. Nathan's eyes flicked over to where the thing stood, and for the briefest moment, Emma thought he had seen it. But his expression was confused, unseeing. He didn't look terrified, just disoriented. He shook his head, a slight frown forming on his face. "What's happening, Em?" "There's nothing there." She blinked, and for a moment, the thing was gone. Just vanished into thin air. Her breath caught as her eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of it. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive stillness of the house. Only Nathan, who was still standing there, his face filled with concern. "You're not making sense," Nathan said gently, his voice calm, too calm. "Come back to bed. You're just stressed out. You need to relax." No. No, it was real. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't. The thing had been right there, mocking her, waiting. She couldn't understand why Nathan couldn't see it, why he wasn't reacting the way she was. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear starting to shift into something else, something darker. Was it possible? Was it possible that the house was playing tricks on them? That the walls, the very foundation, had something to do with all of this? Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. The more she tried to explain it to Nathan, the more distant he seemed. She could see the concern in his eyes, but it was mixed with confusion. The rational side of him couldn't comprehend what was happening. But Emma knew. She knew the house wasn't what it seemed. The air around them felt thicker now. Heavy. Pressing in. And in the distance, deep in the house, she thought she heard something again. A whisper. "Emma, come closer." It came from the walls. And this time, Nathan didn't hear it. The house had already begun to claim her. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was off about Nathan's sudden indifference. She could see the concern in his eyes, but it was like he was looking at her through a fog. She could tell he didn't believe her, he didn't understand. And that terrified her more than anything. She watched him walk back down the hallway, still rubbing his eyes, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was still half asleep. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were alive, waiting. She followed him into the living room, still looking over her shoulder, expecting to see the thing lurking in the corner. But it was gone. Everything was still. Nathan flopped onto the couch with a sigh, rubbing his hands over his face. You're scaring me. Whatever you saw, it's not real. The house is just old. You're exhausted, that's all." "I'm not tired," she snapped, her voice trembling, her hands shaking. "Nathan, you didn't see it. You didn't hear it. You have to believe me." But Nathan just looked at her with those confused, concerned eyes. "I want to believe you, Em. I do. But there's nothing here. You've got to calm down. Please." His voice was gentle, but to Emma, it felt like he was dismissing her, like she was crazy. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She froze. The window was shut. The wind rattled the glass in the frame, the trees outside shaking violently as if they were being whipped by a storm. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that she could see her breath puffing out in front of her, and a chill ran down her spine. She glanced toward the window, but there was no sign of anything that could have caused it. Nathan didn't seem to notice. He was still slouched on the couch, rubbing his eyes again. His back was to her, and she could see the tired lines on his face. But Emma couldn't tear her gaze away from the window. Something was wrong. The wind shouldn't be blowing like that. It wasn't a storm. The sky was clear, too clear. The house had been silent all night. She hadn't heard a single creak or groan, and now, this. The wind shouldn't have come from inside the house. Her pulse quickened. "Nathan," she whispered. "Something's not right. Please, please listen to me. We need to leave." Nathan gave her a soft, exasperated sigh and turned to face her. You're not making any sense. We just moved in. The house is old. It's probably just drafts, the house settling. Please, calm down." As he spoke, Emma felt a prickling sensation crawl up her neck, like fingers were brushing against her skin, just out of reach. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the feeling. But the room was empty, save for her and Nathan. And then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, scraping. It came from the hallway. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like something heavy was being moved across the floor. The noise was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a jolt of cold terror through Emma's body. Nathan didn't hear it. He was still looking at her, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "What's wrong?" You look like you've seen a ghost. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, rattling noise. The floorboards in the hallway groaned as though something, or someone, was moving in the darkness. Emma's heart skipped a beat. This time, Nathan had to hear it. She couldn't be the only one. She couldn't be the only one hearing these things. She leaped to her feet. Nathan, do you hear that? Nathan blinked and followed her gaze, his brows furrowed. What are you talking about? There's nothing. The scraping noise grew louder, closer now, as though something was dragging itself toward them. Emma's legs trembled beneath her, and she took a step toward the hallway, her mind screaming for her to run, to get out of the house, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes locked onto the darkness of the hallway, the narrow, empty corridor beyond the threshold of the living room. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Dead silence. Emma's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She turned to Nathan, her voice cracking. There's something in the house. Something, in the walls. I heard it, I felt it. Nathan looked at her, his face pale, his expression softening with what almost looked like concern. He stood up from the couch, slowly, and walked toward her. This is too much. You need to get some rest. You're not hearing things. This is all just stress. The move. The isolation. The quiet. But Emma could barely focus on his words. The moment he crossed the threshold into the hallway, her eyes locked onto something moving in the shadows. A dark figure. No longer a silhouette, but a person-shaped shadow, shifting, almost gliding along the wall. It wasn't Nathan. This thing was taller, its outline warped, its form too fluid, too unnatural. Emma's heart raced, her throat tight with panic. Nathan, she choked, but it was too late. He didn't hear her. He was already stepping toward the shadow, his back to her. The thing shifted again, moving closer to Nathan. He paused, his eyes darting between the hallway and Emma. What is it, Em? You're scaring me. I see it, Emma whispered, unable to tear her gaze away from the dark figure that was now halfway down the hallway. The shadows seemed to gather around it, darkening the room, thickening the air. She reached out, her hand trembling. Nathan, please. But Nathan turned, completely oblivious to the thing that was now just inches from him. He stepped forward, and the shadow lunged. Emma screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Nathan fell, hard, with a sickening thud. His body jerked as if something had grabbed him, but there was no one there. Emma's knees buckled beneath her. She rushed to his side, her heart in her throat. His eyes were wide, unseeing, and he was convulsing, gasping for air like he couldn't breathe. Nathan. Nathan. She shook him, but it was no use. His body was rigid, his chest heaving as if he was caught in some invisible trap. The house felt colder now, the silence almost deafening as the shadows in the room seemed to close in around her. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice. Not Nathan's. Not anything human. Leave him. It's too late. Emma froze, every muscle in her body locking up as the voice echoed in the room. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, alive with an energy she couldn't understand. And just like that, she understood. She wasn't just trapped in the house. The house had claimed them. The room felt colder now, colder than it ever had before, as though the house itself had decided to turn against them. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside Nathan, whose body was still twitching uncontrollably. His breath came in ragged gasps, as though every inhale took all his strength, his face contorted in terror. She shook him harder. Nathan. Please, wake up. Please, you have to wake up. But his eyes remained unseeing, his mouth open, lips trembling. She could feel the weight of the darkness closing in around them, and the silence. No, the oppressive stillness, was suffocating. The house was too quiet. Too aware. It was as if every corner, every shadow, was alive, watching, waiting. A low, raspy whisper echoed from the walls, distant but unmistakable. The words were soft at first, like a murmur in the dark. Leave. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She couldn't tell if the voice came from inside her head or if it was real, coming from somewhere in the house, but it felt close, too close. It was like the house itself was alive, every inch of it breathing in time with her own heartbeat. She pulled away from Nathan, looking around the room, scanning every corner, every crevice. There was something wrong with everything. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. Leave him. Emma's skin prickled, and she backed away, her legs trembling as the cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones. The walls around her groaned, creaked, and then, something else. A scraping noise. It came from beneath the floorboards, like claws scraping against wood, slowly and deliberately. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to run, but her legs were frozen, her body stiff with terror. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the walls, or the shadows. Something was inside, something that had been waiting for them. Waiting for her. She felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Her breath hitched, and she forced herself to focus on Nathan. She couldn't leave him. He was her husband, and she couldn't let whatever had happened to him take him away. He needed her. But every instinct screamed for her to flee, to escape, to save herself. Nathan, she cried, shaking him again. This time, his body jerked violently, as though he was fighting against something unseen. A guttural, strangled sound escaped his throat, and Emma recoiled in fear. His eyes opened, wide, wild, unseeing, but there was no recognition in them. Just sheer, unadulterated terror. Nathan, please, please tell me what's happening. Her voice cracked as she tried to hold him steady, but it felt like she was holding on to something other. Something that wasn't fully human anymore. The whisper came again, this time louder, echoing in her skull, inside her very bones. You should have left. Her hands shook as she tried to pull Nathan to his feet, but it was like he was dead weight. He was unresponsive, his limbs stiff, his chest barely rising with each strained breath. The skin beneath her fingers was cold, too cold. His face was pale, his lips a faint blue, as if life itself had drained from him. Emma's mind raced. She needed to get him out of the house, but how? She could barely hold on to him, let alone drag him through the house. The door, she had to get to the door. But the shadows in the room seemed to pulse, growing thicker, darker. And then she heard it. A low, eerie sound, a hum that came from the very walls themselves. It wasn't a sound she could hear with her ears, but something deeper, something primal. It was a vibration, a hum that resonated through her very core. And in the distance, just beyond her sight, a figure moved. She couldn't see it clearly, but the outline of it was unmistakable. Tall, gaunt, with long, spindly limbs. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its shadow stretched across the floor as it inched closer, creeping toward her with agonizing slowness. Emma's heart stopped. Leave. The voice came again, this time so close, so real, that she felt it inside her chest. The whisper was coming from the thing in the shadows, the thing that had been waiting for her. Waiting for them. The creature, whatever it was, shifted again, stepping forward with a deliberate slowness, dragging itself across the floor, its long fingers scraping against the wood. It was getting closer, the shadow spreading like ink on a page, consuming the light. No. Emma gasped, stepping back, her heart hammering in her throat. Please, please, stop. But the thing didn't stop. It didn't even seem to acknowledge her words. It was drawn to her, like a predator to prey, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its limbs twisted at impossible angles, its body warping in ways that defied reason. Nathan stirred again, but his eyes remained unfocused, his lips moving in silent words. His breathing was shallow, strained. The longer she looked at him, the more she began to wonder, was this still Nathan? Or had the house already claimed him, just like it had claimed everything else? The thing in the shadows spoke again, its voice a rasping hiss that sent chills through her very soul. "He belongs to us now." Emma gasped in horror. She couldn't understand. She didn't want to understand. She wanted to run, to scream, but all she could do was watch as the creature moved closer. Its hand, if it could even be called a hand, reached toward Nathan, its fingers stretched and twisting unnaturally, its nails long and jagged like claws. "No!" Emma screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She lunged forward, grabbing Nathan by the shoulders and pulling him away from the thing, but it was like trying to move a boulder. He wouldn't budge. She couldn't move him. It was as if the weight of the house itself had pinned him down, trapping them both in this nightmare. The creature stopped. Its head tilted again, this time almost as if it was studying her, inspecting her with those hollow, empty eyes. And then, with a low growl, it spoke again. "You cannot save him. It is already too late." Emma's heart was pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fight this. But the creature was right. It was too late. The house had already taken Nathan, and now, it wanted her, too. But Emma wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't give up. With all the strength she could muster, she reached for the door. The shadows crept around her feet, thick and sticky, as if the house itself were trying to pull her down. The creature watched her, its mouth stretching into a twisted smile. "You will not leave." But Emma didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As her hand reached the door, she felt a pulse of energy, a sharp, electric shock that reverberated through her. The door snapped open. And for a moment, she thought she was free. But as she turned back to grab Nathan's hand, she saw the thing step into the doorway, its long limbs blocking the exit. There was no escape. Not anymore. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, the sound vibrating through the entire house. Emma's heart was still racing, her breath ragged, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't stop long enough to think, to comprehend what had just happened. The thing was still there, waiting for her, watching her with those hollow, black eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul. The air was thick with the weight of its presence, oppressive and suffocating. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't just stand there and let it take her too. Not when Nathan was still breathing, barely. He was still her husband, and she wasn't going to let this thing claim him without a fight. She couldn't. The thing in the hallway didn't move. It stood still, its form frozen in the dark, its long, twisted fingers reaching out like tendrils in the gloom. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Emma could feel its gaze boring into her. It was like it was reading her thoughts, pulling every ounce of fear from her. But something inside her snapped. The fear had been building up for so long, suffocating her, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her temples. If she let it continue, if she let it win, it would all be over. Nathan would be lost, and she'd be next. And maybe, just maybe, this thing wasn't all powerful. Maybe there was a way to break free. She grabbed Nathan's arm again, her fingers tightening around him. He was so cold. So cold and lifeless. She could barely feel any pulse at his neck. His skin had gone pale, almost translucent, and his body felt like a corpse in her arms. His mouth was still open, frozen in the last expression of fear, but there was no sign of life. The house was stealing him, inch by inch. "No," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. "I won't let you take him. I won't let you take both of us." With one last glance at the dark figure in the hallway, Emma hoisted Nathan up, dragging him toward the door. The shadows at her feet shifted, but she ignored them. They were nothing more than a threat, an illusion. If she could just get Nathan out, she would have a chance. If she could just get him to safety. But the hallway was getting darker. The once familiar walls were now closing in around her, the air growing colder with every step. The hum from the walls had returned, louder this time, and it vibrated in her chest, making her bones ache. The floor creaked underfoot as she dragged Nathan's limp body forward, his feet dragging against the wooden floor. And then, she heard it. A soft, familiar sound, the sound of breathing. But it wasn't Nathan's breath. No. This was something else. Something darker. Something older. Emma turned sharply, her heart sinking in her chest. It was the sound of a door opening. Not just any door, though. The door at the end of the hallway, the door they had never opened, the door that had been locked since they moved in. The door that shouldn't have even been there. The dark figure shifted again, its long limbs stretching impossibly far, its face now visible in the dim light. It was grinning. A twisted, horrible grin that made Emma's stomach churn. It didn't move toward her. Instead, it just watched, as if it knew exactly what was happening, as if it knew what was coming. The door creaked open, a slow, agonizing sound that seemed to echo through the house. A thin sliver of light spilled into the hallway, and Emma felt her blood run cold. The light coming from that door was wrong. It wasn't natural. It didn't belong. It wasn't from the outside, not from the moon, not from the stars. It was pale, almost sickly, and it seemed to breathe, shifting, pulsating like a living thing. It was as if the house had opened a rift, a tear in the very fabric of reality itself. And then, from the darkness behind the door, something moved. A figure. A shadow. A woman. She stepped into the light. Her skin was as pale as death, her eyes hollow and empty. Her hair was long, tangled, and black, and it hung over her face like a veil. She looked wrong. Everything about her screamed unnatural, inhuman. She moved forward with a slow, deliberate grace, her steps silent as she glided toward Emma, as though the floorboards beneath her didn't even make a sound. Emma froze. Her body was trembling with fear, her grip on Nathan loosening. She wanted to scream, to run, but the woman's gaze was locked onto hers, and Emma felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a cold, heavy dread. You can't leave," the woman whispered, her voice hollow, like the sound of wind through a cracked window. Her mouth didn't move. The words didn't come from her lips, they came from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper, inside the walls, inside the very house itself. Emma's chest tightened as the woman's eyes seemed to pierce through her, reaching into her very soul. "This place, this house, it never lets go. You will never escape." Emma shook her head, struggling to breathe, struggling to think. The woman's eyes were empty, black, void of all life. And the longer Emma looked at her, the more she felt like she was being pulled in, sucked into the abyss behind her gaze. And then the woman spoke again, her voice growing louder, more insistent. "You belong to it now. Just like he does." The words were a death sentence. She could feel it. She could feel the house closing around her, squeezing out any hope, any chance of escape. The shadows were thickening again, wrapping around her legs, crawling up her arms, dragging her deeper into the nightmare. Emma turned sharply, her heart racing, her mind on fire. She had to leave. She had to get out. But the door at the end of the hallway, the one that had opened on its own, was now closed. Shut tight. And the air around her was thick with a pressure that made it impossible to breathe. Her throat tightened, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't escape. And then she saw it. A small crack in the floor, just under Nathan's feet, where the boards had split apart. Something was moving beneath the floorboards. It was coming from underneath the house. Something alive. Emma let out a scream of desperation, but it was drowned out by a loud crack that split the air. The floor beneath her gave way, and before she could even react, she was falling. Falling into the darkness. The ground beneath her was cold, slick, like something wet and slippery, and as she fell deeper, she felt the floorboards snap around her, the house groaning, twisting, as if it were alive. A shrill, piercing laugh echoed through the house, an echo that seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere. And then, in the suffocating darkness, she realized. There was no escape. Not anymore. The fall felt endless. Time bent and warped around Emma as she plummeted into the black abyss beneath the floor. The house was swallowing her whole, its walls closing in with a sickening, rhythmic pulse, as though it was feeding on her fear. Her body collided with the cold earth, a sharp pain shooting up her spine, but she barely felt it. The darkness had consumed her, and the world above was now distant, muffled. She lay there for a moment, her breath shallow, her chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The air down here smelled damp and rancid, like old decay. The silence was absolute, suffocating. There was no sound of Nathan's breathing. No sign of life. She couldn't even hear the hum from the walls that had tormented her upstairs. But then, from the depths of the inky blackness, a whisper, soft, barely audible, cut through the silence. "You're too late." Emma's skin crawled. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied whisper that sent waves of cold terror crashing over her. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to her feet, her hands groping in the dark, searching for something, anything, that could give her an escape. But there was nothing. Nothing but darkness and the cold, oppressive weight of the house pressing in on her. Too late to save him. The whisper came again, growing louder, more insistent, its tone mocking. It seemed to echo off the walls, reverberating through her very bones. She stumbled forward, her legs shaking, her head spinning. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but there was no escape. The house was alive, and it had claimed her, just as it had claimed Nathan. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone walls, and in that moment, she felt something other, beneath her fingertips. The surface of the wall was rough, but there was a strange pulse beneath it, a rhythmic thudding that made her stomach turn. She pulled her hand away, horrified, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. The walls were breathing. A sickening, unnatural ripple moved through the surface of the stone, like the skin of a living creature. It was as if the house itself was alive, and it was watching her, feeding on her fear. Emma's breath hitched as she backed away, but the walls pressed in on her. The deeper she went, the tighter the space became. And then she heard it. A soft scuffling sound from somewhere ahead. The sound of something dragging itself across the ground, something large, something heavy. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she turned her head, but saw nothing, just the endless, impenetrable blackness. "It's already too late for him." The voice spoke again, this time from directly behind her. Emma froze, her heart in her throat, and she turned slowly. Her pulse raced, but there was nothing there. Only the oppressive silence, the weight of the house closing in around her like a tomb. She felt the weight of the presence behind her, though, pressing in from all sides. The whispering voice, so cold and distant, was all around her now, circling her, enveloping her like a dark cloud. "Leave him." The words were a command, cold and final. Emma's chest tightened. She didn't want to leave him. She couldn't leave him. Nathan needed her. She wasn't going to let him disappear into this hellhole. He's already gone. The voice was almost a taunt now, its tone dripping with malice, as though the house was playing with her, testing her resolve. She felt the weight of its words pressing down on her, suffocating her, like a shroud of despair wrapping tighter and tighter around her chest. "No," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "No. He's not gone. I won't let you take him." But the house didn't respond. There was no answer, no movement, just the thick, suffocating darkness. The whispering continued, low and guttural, like a chorus of voices coming from within the walls themselves. She could feel them now, the eyes of the house on her, the eyes of something else lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. Something was moving in the dark. A figure, hunched and twisted, appeared in the distance, its outline faint at first, but then it solidified, emerging from the blackness like a ghost. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. It was Nathan. But it wasn't him, not anymore. His body was twisted, contorted in unnatural ways. His arms hung limp at his sides, his head bent at a grotesque angle, his eyes wide open, but they were empty, hollow, dark pools of nothingness. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth was twisted into a silent scream, though no sound came from it. It was as if he were trapped inside his own body, unable to break free. "Nathan?" Emma whispered, taking a tentative step forward. Her voice was barely a breath, her heart breaking in her chest. "Nathan, please, it's me. It's Emma." But the thing that had once been her husband didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge her. It just stood there, unmoving, staring at her with those hollow eyes. The house groaned. And then the figure moved. It didn't move like a human. It was jerky, unnatural, its limbs bending at wrong angles, dragging itself forward with an eerie, guttural rasp. Emma's heart skipped a beat as it crawled toward her, its movements disturbing, like something that wasn't quite alive. The air around her grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. She could feel the presence of the house closing in on her, suffocating her, like it was feeding off her fear. She backed away, her eyes never leaving Nathan's twisted form, but the floor beneath her feet began to shift. The walls were shifting, moving, rearranging themselves, as if the house were changing around her, closing off every escape route. And then she heard it. A voice. Her own voice, echoing from the darkness. "You can't escape. He's gone. You're next." Her own words twisted in the air, mocking her, making her head spin. She spun around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, empty space that seemed to stretch on forever. She turned back to Nathan, no, to the thing that had once been Nathan, and saw the figure standing even closer now. Its face was still twisted in that grotesque scream, its mouth gaping open, and then, just as Emma's heart seemed to stop, the figure moved again. This time, it wasn't crawling. It was running. A sickening, guttural screech filled the air as the thing lunged at her, its mouth opening impossibly wide, its hands reaching for her. And then, everything went black. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Emma couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, she felt it. A cold hand on her arm. It wasn't Nathan's hand. It was something else. Something wrong. And it was pulling her down. Farther down. Into the heart of the house. Into the depths of its hunger. The darkness was all-consuming, suffocating, as if it had substance, wrapping itself around Emma like 1,000 invisible hands. Her mind was a blur, thoughts jumbled and twisted, too fast, too slow. She couldn't think clearly. Her body felt weightless, like she was floating, or maybe sinking. There was no sense of direction, no sense of time. Only the void. Only the unrelenting pressure of the house. Something was dragging her. She could feel it, a cold, clammy touch gripping her arm, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The sensation was wrong. It didn't feel human. It felt like something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. Her breath was ragged, panic setting in again as her body began to jerk involuntarily with each tug. She tried to scream, but the air was thick, like a heavy weight was pressing down on her chest, forcing the breath out of her lungs before she could even manage a sound. It was as though the very atmosphere in the house was alive, feeding on her terror, becoming more oppressive with each passing moment. "Help me. Nathan." Her voice barely made it past her throat, the words sounding weak, hollow, as if they were being swallowed by the void around her. But there was no answer. Only the eerie, deafening silence that seemed to stretch forever. The thing was still there, dragging her deeper into the unknown. She tried to fight it, her limbs heavy, uncooperative. She reached out, trying to grasp at anything, but her hands only brushed against the cold walls, which felt like they were pulsing under her fingertips. The pulse seemed to have a rhythm, a heartbeat that was not her own. Emma's eyes strained in the dark, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see anything clearly. There was only the faint shimmer of movement just beyond her reach. She heard the sound of breathing again, labored, slow, wet. It was the breath of something that wasn't alive, yet it was. The kind of breath that seemed to pull the life out of the room itself. Then, through the thick darkness, she saw it. A shadow moving, slowly, deliberately. At first, it was just a shift in the blackness, but then it began to take form. A figure. A shape. Human, or something like it, but wrong. So wrong. Its body seemed twisted, its limbs stretched at unnatural angles, like a puppet with its strings pulled too tight. Its face was obscured by a mass of long, filthy hair, but Emma could feel its eyes. Cold, empty eyes. Watching her. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice jagged, rasping, like nails scratching on a chalkboard. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice of the house. The voice of the darkness. The thing moved closer, its limbs making sickening, crackling sounds as it crept forward. Its presence was suffocating, pressing down on Emma with the weight of 1,000 years of hunger. It was drawing closer, and she couldn't move. Her body refused to cooperate. The cold, invisible grip on her arm tightened, pulling her in. Suddenly, the figure's face shifted into view. Emma recoiled, her stomach lurching as she took in the grotesque sight. The face was pale, almost translucent, its features stretched and warped. It had no mouth, no nose, just hollow eyes that bore into her with an unnerving intensity. The skin around its eyes was sunken, black veins crawling up its face, like the decay of something ancient. And then, the worst part, the smile. A gaping, jagged mouth split the skin of its face, wide enough to show rows of sharp, jagged teeth, teeth that glistened in the dim light, as though they had never been touched by a human breath. It grinned at her, the grin stretching impossibly wide, until it was the only thing she could see. "You are mine now," the thing whispered, its voice like a distant echo, hollow and broken. Fear washed over Emma in waves, her heart hammering in her chest, her entire body trembling. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her voice was trapped inside her. The thing was too close now, its breath hot on her face, and she could feel its hunger, the desire to rip her apart, to consume her, body and soul. She tried to close her eyes, to block out the horror, but the image of the thing was burned into her mind. Its eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, drilled into her thoughts. They seemed to be everywhere. Watching. Waiting. But then, a sound. A distant sound. A crack, followed by a low moan. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but then it grew louder. Closer. It was the sound of something breaking. Something inside the house. The walls trembled, as if reacting to the sound, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shuddering in anticipation. The thing's grin faded, replaced by a look of confusion. It tilted its head, as though trying to understand the noise. Emma's breath hitched as she realized what was happening. The house was shifting. Changing. The walls were moving again, rearranging themselves, and the floor beneath her feet was shifting, twisting, bending. A tremor ran through the ground, and then Emma heard it, the sound of something slithering. Something big. Something massive, dragging itself across the floor, coming closer with every passing second. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The house was alive, and it was feeding on her. Feeding on her fear. The thing in front of her began to retreat, its limbs jerking backward as if it was trying to escape the sound. But Emma wasn't looking at it anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the creature that was emerging from the depths of the house. It was monstrous. A massive shape, impossibly large, dark as night. It moved with a sickening grace, its body twisting, undulating, like a serpent. But there was no body. It was just movement, a formless shape, made of shadows and something else, something worse. The very air around it seemed to distort, like it was sucking the life from the room. And then, as it neared, Emma saw it. A face. Or what might have once been a face. It was humanoid, but the features were all wrong. Twisted, contorted, as if the house itself had molded it out of some nightmarish vision. The eyes were black pools, endless and deep, and its mouth, the thing didn't have a mouth. Instead, there was just a gaping hole in the center of its face, a void that swallowed the light around it. It moved toward Emma with slow, deliberate steps, its enormous limbs dragging across the ground, making the floorboards creak under its weight. It was close now, so close she could feel the air shift as it moved. The smell was overwhelming, rot, decay, and something far worse. It wasn't natural. It was hunger. The kind of hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The kind that would devour everything in its path. "You will feed it," a voice hissed in her ear, low and slithering. It was the same voice, the same whisper that had tormented her before, but now it was joined by others, dozens of them, all speaking at once, their words overlapping, merging into a maddening symphony of hunger. "We will feed it all." Emma couldn't breathe. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath shallow and ragged. This was it. This was the end. She was trapped, surrounded by the very thing that had haunted them all along, the house. It was alive, and it was feeding on them, on their fear, on their souls. With one final, terrifying screech, the creature lunged forward, its body contorting in ways that defied logic, its black eyes locking onto hers. And then, nothing. Silence. Complete and utter silence. The air hung still, heavy, suffocating. Emma was frozen, her heart pounding, but she didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe. The darkness was absolute. And in that moment, she realized the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. She had been swallowed whole by the house, just as it had swallowed Nathan, just as it had swallowed everyone who had ever walked through its doors. The house had won. And there was nothing left to do but feed,